Chapter 1156. She burrowed into his arms. She was not a loving mother. She was also his little darling. Tang Yu looked at her and found it both funny and annoying. It was just like what his mother had said. There were 2 children in the family, but she was fine like this. Pei Chichi howled and blinked at Xiaoxin. Xiaoxin smiled happily. Mama was not angry anymore. At noon, Lin Yun and Zhao Yi brought little Zhao Yang over. Little Zhao Yang was born 2 months later than Xiaoxin, but he looked much more mature. He was a standard little gentleman, very much like Zhao Yi. Although Pei Chichi did not remember, her marriage with Qin Anlan had already been dissolved. How could she be with Tang Yu without any status? Moreover, they were husband and wife before, so they still had to get a certificate. As for the wedding, Tang Yu rejected it without thinking. He had a shadow over the wedding. After Lin Yun and the others left, Pei Xiaoqi made a fuss and hung on Tang Yu like a little monkey. You don't want to have a wedding? You must think that I'm married for the 2nd time, right? Tang Yu sat in the study reading documents and looked at Pei Chichi with slight disdain. He coughed lightly. Pei Chichi, you're not married for the 2nd time. You're married for the 3rd and 4th time. Her eyes widened. He kissed her seductive little mouth and chuckled. However, I'm still your only man. She was still petrified. He said that she was married for the 3rd and 4th time. Tang Yu. She snorted. You're so annoying. He laughed silently. Just because of such childish words, even if she was married 100 times, she would still be the 20-year-old girl in his heart, appearing in his room so tenderly. Then what do you not hate? He pretended to be focused on work. His gaze fell on the work and his voice was indifferent. I'll try my best to do it. Pei Chichi knelt in front of him and snatched the document from his hand. I want you to take back what you said just now. Tang Yu's gaze paused on her little face for a few seconds before he smiled. Chichi, you're becoming more and more like a child. I quite like it. He pinched her little face. I've always been tolerant of you. She could sense that he was in a good mood. Presumably, it was because she and Qin Anlan had broken up. In the past, he didn't show off much, as if he didn't care much about it. But now, he really showed his true nature. Pei Chichi pinched his face angrily. I want to wear a wedding dress. Mr. Tang nodded in agreement. Well, you can wear it for me alone. She stared at him blankly. Tang Yu got up and took her hand to the dressing room attached to the bedroom. He pressed a button and the wall of the dressing room moved to the side. In the huge space, a wedding dress decorated with Swarovski crystals hung in the middle, dazzling and dazzling. Pei Chichi raised her head and opened her mouth slightly, feeling a little surprised. Do you want to try it on? He pressed her shoulder and smiled. Pei Chichi's voice was like a little lamb. Tang Yu, is it really mine? Here, even I am yours. He hugged her from behind and whispered in her ear. It was hoarse and pleasant. Let me help you change. Before she could say no, her dress fell to the ground. He personally helped her put on the wedding dress. It was a British-style wedding dress made of tens of thousands of crystals. It was very heavy, but it was super dreamy. Chapter 1157. He pulled her hair up and secured it with a diamond hairpin. Looking at herself in the mirror, she looked like a princess from a fairy tale. Tang Yu squatted down to help her put on her crystal shoes. She was standing and he was half kneeling in front of her, looking a little humble. Holding her fair feet, Tang Yu lowered his head and kissed the hem of her dress. His voice was hoarse. Chichi, this is our wedding. She was stunned. He got up and hugged her in his arms. She felt a warm sensation on her neck. Was that because he was crying? After a long time, she heard his voice. Chichi, welcome home. Now, she was finally back. She was no longer someone else's wife, but Tang Yu's. Pei Chichi looked up at his handsome face and smiled. Mr. Tang, can I have a dance with you? Even if she didn't remember, he loved her and she loved him. That was enough. Even if their memories started from that dance, it was still perfect. At least, she fell in love with him at first sight, or rather, his body at first sight. Tang Yu smiled. Of course. They danced in the bedroom for the whole day until she was exhausted. In the end, she was forced to sign the marriage contract. That night, she was pressed down by him for the whole night. Pei Chichi shed tears and reflected on life. Actually, it was better to be single. At least it wasn't so tiring, or it was better to be Anlan's wife. It wouldn't be so tiring and she wouldn't have to do physical labor. Pei Chichi was especially honest now. She dared to say and do what she wanted. Hence, Tang Yu pressed down on her even more. She was exhausted and he was too shameless. She couldn't take it anymore and wanted to sleep. It was useless even if she begged him. In the wee hours of the morning, he was still in high spirits and lectured, "Baby, call daddy and you'll sleep." She didn't want to call him that. He was so perverted. But if she didn't, Tang Yu pressed down on her and whipped her mercilessly. It was useless even if she begged for death. She could only cry out obediently with tears in her eyes. But he had lied to her. He had clearly said that he would let her go once he called out. In the end, he had been hot-blooded the entire night and hadn't let her go. But this time, she didn't feel any pain. Perhaps it was because she was no longer in pain and was starting to feel something again, so Tang Yu was exceptionally open. The man who had been repressed for 2 years had finally unleashed his beastly nature. In the end, it was messy and tiring. She had to go to work the next day. Pei Chichi hurriedly got up and hammered Tang Yu's shoulder. "I want to go to work." He carried her to the bathroom and carried her like a baby to wash her face and brush her teeth. In the end, the two of them shared a tube of toothpaste. While the two of them were fooling around, Pei Chichi suddenly said, "I want to go collecting next week." She said it in his arms. Tang Yu frowned and looked at her. "Where to?" They had just gotten together and he didn't want to separate from her. Besides, what was the point of collecting? He still wanted to fool around. Pei Chichi stopped him and said in a low voice, "It's a charity photography exhibition." "Tang Yu, I want to go." He smiled helplessly. "You must have been duped by old Khan, right?" Pei Chichi's eyes widened. Tang Yu smiled. "Old Khan has duped a lot of people in the past 2 years. But he's really a good person." He thought for a moment. "I can go, but I can't go alone." Chapter 1158. After that, Tang Yu carried Pei Chichi to put on her clothes, as though he was taking care of little Shinshin. However, Pei Chichi was still biting on his body. Because she couldn't look into his neck, how was she going to get out like that? Tang Yu smiled and kissed her. This is a normal thing between a husband and wife. His nose touched hers gently and he paused for a moment before saying meaningfully, "Chichi, you're much better than before." Much better. Pei Chichi looked at him with tears in her eyes. She glared at him for a while. "You're so naughty. Isn't that so?" He pressed her little face against his chest and whispered naughtily beside her ear, "Didn't you feel much better just now? You know you need to ask for more." She was a little shy and bit his neck. "Don't say any more." Tang Yu saw that she was really shy. He laughed and finally let her go, carrying her downstairs for breakfast. Downstairs, the maids lined up in a row and smiled. "Good morning, sir and madam." Tang Yu nodded his head nobly. Pei Chichi punched his shoulder with her little fist. "Even if I marry you like this, isn't it too much of a loss?" Her eyes were lively and dazzling. He looked at her for a while before saying, "Chichi, do you still want to wear the wedding gown?" She covered her face. She didn't want to hear it anymore. He was a pervert. That gorgeous and dreamy wedding dress had been torn in half by him with one hand. She didn't want to wear it anymore. She stared at him with watery eyes. Tang Yu's heart softened and he stroked her hair. "Eat your breakfast. I'll send you to work later." Pei Chichi drank her milk. "Don't you have to work today?" Tang Yu laid out the napkin and looked at her. He said slowly, "I'm on marriage leave." Pei Chichi was shocked. She stared at him deeply and weakly. Tang Yu chuckled. "Chichi, you can apply for marriage leave too." "I don't want to. There's no wedding, and I've been married a few times already." She pouted, looking aggrieved. Mr. Tang happily agreed. "That's true. How about this? I'll send you to work every day during the wedding break, okay?" Pei Chichi did not reply and continued eating her breakfast. Tang Yu suddenly said, "Chichi, I made breakfast. She looked at him and was a little surprised. She didn't expect him to wake up so early to make breakfast for her when there were so many servants in the house. Looking at her silly look, Tang Yu smiled and patted her head as if he was patting a lamb. Mrs. Tang, do you feel like a newlywed? She glanced at him and continued to eat her breakfast. However, her breakfast was sweet. Tang Yu looked at her satisfied little face, and his heart was also satisfied. She would be cute no matter what she turned into, although she was a little silly. In fact, his Chichi was originally a silly girl. It was only because she had worked too hard in the past that she looked more mature than her peers. Now, he was willing to spoil her until she was 8 years old. It would be best if she couldn't take care of herself. This was a little perverted idea in Tang Yu's heart. Pei Chichi had not changed from being a wife to a man. Fortunately, she always thought of Xiaoshan before going to work, so she ran upstairs to see her. Xiaoshan was still asleep. She was sleeping like a little piglet and was very fragrant. Pei Chichi looked at her and leaned over to kiss the little person. The more she looked at her, the more cute she looked, like a little pig. Chapter 1159. She felt very proud. Tang Yu found it funny, but he smiled and said, "Of course." Pei Chichi looked at him for a long time before she reluctantly left. As soon as she left, Xiaoshan opened her eyes and touched her face with her little hand. Mom kissed her. Xiaoshan opened her other hand and there was a milk bun in it. Xiaoshan looked at it and tears welled up in her eyes again. The milk bun had become hard. Downstairs, Tang Yu fastened his seatbelt and looked at Pei Chichi beside him. He smiled and said, "Chichi, this is for you." He threw a big bag of wedding candies on her lap. Pei Chichi hugged it subconsciously and looked at it carefully before she snorted, "I don't want it." "Shouldn't we give wedding candies to your colleagues when we get married?" He turned the steering wheel easily and glanced at her. Pei Chichi hugged the wedding candies and said, "I don't want it." "Then I'll give it to them," Tang Yu said infuriatingly. After he said that, Pei Chichi glared at him, but he didn't get angry. He still smiled and said, "Chichi, shouldn't you let your colleagues know your husband?" She bit her little finger. When did he become so amiable? She didn't understand, but when she came to Jiren magazine, she saw his dark thoughts clearly. Was there anyone who gave wedding candies and told their male colleagues that he was Pei Chichi's husband? He had told everyone in Jiren magazine, young and old. Pei Chichi was terrified. What happened to being a domineering CEO? What happened to being noble? She stared at him, and he smiled indulgently and reached out to touch her little head. "Please take care of our Xiao Qi in the future." It was like he was sending his little daughter to school. How was this giving out wedding candies? It was simply feeding them dog food. The male colleagues ate dog food while giving up on their goddess. Sure enough, the goddess belonged to the CEO. Tang Yu didn't stay long. He just locked himself in the office with Laro Khan and smoked 2 cigarettes before leaving. When they came out, Laro Khan had his arm around Tang Yu's shoulder. Pei Chichi felt that the world was a little strange. These two people seemed to have a good personal relationship. Tang Yu asked her to walk him to the elevator. She could not hide her thoughts from him at all. He became serious and coughed lightly. "Chichi, Laro Khan and I were talking about public welfare just now." Pei Chichi couldn't help but laugh. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with warmth. He had done a lot for her and given her enough freedom. He said that as long as she had enough flying, she would remember that there was a home in B City and 2 people waiting for her. However, he was such a good person, how could she bear to fly away? Pei Chichi gently stepped forward and hugged his waist. "Tang Yu, thank you. Thank you for waiting for me forever in your best years. Thank you for never giving up. Thank you for helping me and Anlan. Even if in your heart, you never agreed with Anlan's way of doing things." She was so soft in his arms, and Tang Yu's heart softened. He reached out and rubbed her little head. "Chichi, I'm going back. I'll pick you up in the afternoon." "What time do you get off work?" 6 o'clock. She answered obediently, and then raised her little face. He smiled and lowered his head to kiss her. Her little face was a little red, and she slowly withdrew from his arms. Tang Yu rubbed her again, turned around, and walked into the elevator. Pei Chichi watched him leave. She turned around and was about to enter the magazine office when a group of onlookers gathered at the door. Chapter 1160. Amy's smile was especially meaningful. Pei Chichi, do you think you're married by giving out wedding sweets like this? Pei Chichi replied, what else can I do? No matter what, Tang Yu has to do a striptease, or you guys have to perform a 10-minute French kiss. Amy voiced out the thoughts of the onlookers. That scene just now was so beautiful. If they had kissed, the scene would have been so sweet. Pei Chichi nodded and said in a serious manner, I'll ask Tang Yu. So she returned to her seat and waited for him to return home so that she could pass on Amy's message to Tang Yu. Tang Yu only replied 5 minutes later because he had been taking care of Xiaoshan when she went to the toilet. This wedding break had been a great one. After taking care of Xiaoshan, he came out for a breath of fresh air, lit a cigarette and went back. Chichi, what do you want to choose? Pei Chichi looked at the message and snorted softly. It was a standard Tang Chaos-style answer. I choose you to do a striptease. Pei Chichi laughed as she sent the message. He would definitely be angry. Tang Yu looked at the message and laughed. Chichi, I'd rather we kiss. No way. She mischievously sent another message. You're dancing. Tang Yu sent one last message. I'll add one more condition. Give each colleague a red packet of 100,000 yuan and let them choose from 3 conditions. Hence, his wife, who had just started working, asked Amy. After Amy heard the message, she immediately roared, Tang Yu is so inhumane. Pei Chichi looked at her pitifully. Amy immediately cupped her face and said shyly, I choose 100,000 yuan. Everyone voted in favor of 100,000 yuan. Pei Chichi sent a message to Tang Yu and concluded, it's good to be rich. Mr. Tang, who was on his wedding leave, was making mashed potatoes for Xiaoshan. He was wearing the cartoon apron that Xiaoshan had ordered. He held his phone in one hand and sent a message, Chichi, there's nothing that money can't solve. If 100,000 is not enough, then 200,000. Pei Chichi lay on the table, moaning. She thought back to the night before yesterday when she mentioned the charity event. Mr. Tang had made a very difficult request. In the end, she wanted to do charity and he had to pay for the service. That night, Pei Chichi earned more than 3 million yuan. Her mouth was numb. From that night onwards, Pei Chichi felt that Tang Yu was a pervert. Clang. Fen. After that, Tang Yu touched her and said to her meaningfully, Chichi, you have to understand a man who has been single for 2 years. Pei Chichi was so angry that she bit him. But now, he was clearly reminding her of what had happened that night. Her little face felt as though it was on fire. Tang Yu called again. Chichi, I've prepared a sum of money, about 20 million yuan. Do you want it? Yes, she said unwillingly. Tang Yu chuckled. Chichi wants it. Then I'll reluctantly do it tonight. This time, it was a phone call. Pei Chichi did not notice. She blushed and said hurriedly, I said I want money, not that. Isn't it the same? If you want me, you want money, he reminded her. Pei Chichi was defeated. She felt that old Khan's charity event was a fraud, especially when it came to talking about charity with Mr. Tang. After the deal was done, she hung up the phone. Then, she saw pairs of ambiguous eyes. Amy cupped her little heart. Pei Chichi, is this how you and Tang Yu live? Chapter 1161. Pei Chichi's face was very hot. She coughed and said, aren't we newlyweds? Amy looked at her little neck and whimpered, yeah, newlyweds are so intense. Pei Chichi gritted her teeth and pounced on her. Amy screamed. The entire Jiaran magazine office was filled with cheers. When Pei Chichi was done, she stopped and put her arm around Amy's shoulder. She felt a little emotional. Tang Yu had arranged for her to come here probably to make her happy. Tang Yu, thank you. I'm very happy. Not because of anything else, but because I have you to love me. She was in a very excited state the whole day. In the afternoon, Pei Huan also came over with Khan Xing. Poor child, she still hadn't changed her name. Pei Chichi and Pei Huan were now familiar with each other. She looked at Khan Xing and asked Pei Huan, What's your name? Pei Huan looked a little depressed. Kanxing Pei Chichi was stunned for a few seconds, then she laughed and said, Kanxing, Tanxing. Haha, old Khan is really good at giving names. Pei Huan was a little angry. How do you know it was him? Pei Chichi coughed and said, I don't think you have such a great spirit of self-mockery. Pei Chichi, you're still so annoying. Pei Huan said angrily. Pei Chichi was playing with Kanxing. She looked up at Pei Huan and said softly, then why do you still care so much about me? Pei Huan's eyes turned red, but she deliberately hid it and snorted, who cares about you? Come on, you've been away for 2 years and you're even more annoying than before when you come back. Pei Chichi kissed Kanxing and said, I'm back now, aren't I? Pei Huan looked at her for a long time before she said in a low voice, Pei Chichi, fortunately you're back. Otherwise, I'd only have this annoying father and son left in this world. Pei Chichi was a little touched. It was the kind of touching that you knew that no matter where you were, there was always someone waiting for you. She looked at Pei Huan and smiled. I won't leave again. Seeing that she was a little sad, Pei Huan patted her. I heard they got married. When you get married, make me happy. Don't be so happy that we're jealous of you, understand? Pei Chichi just smiled and looked at Pei Huan. She didn't remember this girl who grew up with her but didn't get along with her. Now, she only saw deep feelings in Pei Huan's eyes. Pei Chichi had a feeling that the people around her right now were all people who loved her and her loved ones. Although Tang Yu did not restrict her freedom, he gave her a lot of love. He arranged a lot of love for her. She was touched, so when he came to pick her up, she sat in the car, fastened her seatbelt, and leaned over to kiss his face. Tang Yu paused for a moment, then smiled. What's wrong? Why are you so clingy? Pei Chichi hugged his arm. Tang Yu, how was our movie last year? He lowered his head and pinched her little face. I thought you didn't like to go out. She was very coquettish. We're newlyweds. It's fine if we don't have a wedding, but we can't even go shopping? Of course. He kissed her forehead. Mrs. Tang, sit up straight. We're leaving. She hugged his arm and shook it like a little girl. I want to hug you. Tang Yu shook his head helplessly, but he still drove away. Chapter 1162. Chichi, if you keep looking at me like that, I might not be able to drive properly. He patted her little head, his voice full of affection. She rested her little face on his shoulder. Tang Yu, did I sing well? He sighed. Not really. Mr. Tang, it's not good to be too pragmatic. She leaned on his shoulder and laughed. Tang Yu looked ahead and smiled. Sometimes, it's a good thing. He slowly stopped the car by the roadside. Pei Chichi was a little puzzled. Why did you stop the car? Is the car broken? Mrs. Tang, you broke the traffic rules. He lowered the window and pinched her little nose. Just then, a police car stopped in front of them. 2 police officers got out of the car and walked towards Tang Yu's side of the car. They bowed and greeted him. Sir. Tang Yu opened the door and got out of the car. The policeman took out the ticket. Your female companion didn't strictly follow the traffic rules just now. She's fined 200 yuan. Here you are. Oh yes, please show me your driver's license. Tang Yu turned around. Pei Chichi had already handed him his ID. Tang Yu found it amusing and annoyed at the same time. He took the ID and handed it to the policeman. The policeman copied down the number. When he got to Tang Yu's name, he paused and looked at Tang Yu. He recognized it and was about to say something when Tang Yu said calmly, punish her as you like. I'll get my secretary to handle it later. The policeman smiled and saluted him. Thank you for your cooperation. After that, he became less serious. He looked at Pei Chichi in the car. Is she your wife? Yes. She's still young and doesn't know much. I'll be more careful in the future. Tang Yu kept his ID and got into the car after signaling to the policeman. Pei Chichi looked at him carefully. Tang Yu, I'm sorry. He just faintly grunted in acknowledgement, not saying a word. Pei Chichi pouted. Are there any more movies? Tang Yu looked at her. What do you think? She reached out and hugged him. Yes. With that, she chuckled and nibbled on his neck. Tang Yu looked at her and finally started the car. After dinner, they went to watch a movie. She was as happy as a bird. Tang Yu also let her be. His heart was indescribably satisfied. Whether she remembered or not, she was still his Chichi. When they arrived at the cinema, Pei Chichi was holding a bag of popcorn as she picked out a movie. She saw Yi Liangqiu's new film. It was directed by a certain literary director, and it was a hit. Let's watch this. She held the popcorn in one hand and hooked Tang Yu's arm with the other. She looked up and laughed. Tang Yu looked at her silently and then chuckled. You like watching love rivals kiss scenes? He was being vague. He heard that the bed scenes were quite popular and that Yi Liangqiu would be acting as herself in the movie with the male lead. In short, there were all kinds of rumors. Actually, the movie had been filmed 3 years ago, but it was banned later and the movie went dark. It was only recently reviewed and released. Pei Chichi pouted. She's not my love rival. With that, she laughed again. If she likes you, then she is. Tang Yu touched his smooth chin. Pei Chichi, your words are getting better and better. I learned it from Mr. Tang. She put her little face on his arm and smiled happily. In the end, she almost hung on him and entered the movie. Tang Yu coughed lightly. Chichi, people will laugh at you if you do this. Chapter 1163. He pondered for a moment. Chichi, actually, we can use another method to feel the temperature more directly. Tang Yu, you're getting more and more shameless. After sitting down, she lay in his arms and laughed. He laughed too and stroked her hair. Aren't we going to watch a movie? How are we going to watch it? Pei Chichi cried out, watching a love rival's scene, I have to lie in my husband's arms to feel safe. He was annoyed and amused at the same time. He patted her and focused on watching the movie. The funniest thing was that the person who wanted to watch the movie was sleeping the whole time. He pinched her little face and she laid on the bed, saying that she was tired. Tang Yu watched the sex scene alone. After the movie ended, she woke up and asked him in a daze, what did you see? It ended. Tang Yu held her hand and helped her to pat the popcorn off her body. Pei Chichi exclaimed, it ended? Yes. His tone was obviously not very good. He did not tell her that when a man watched such a movie, he would also have a reaction. It would be very interesting if his wife could cooperate. There were couples all around, but only the one in his house was sleeping like a pig. Pei Chichi looked at him and said, Tang Yu, was it good? She still had the cheek to ask. Tang Yu reached out and pinched her little mouth flat, pulling it to both sides, making it look ugly. Pei Chichi grunted and glared at him. Tang Yu's voice was a little hoarse. Next time, play it again at home. No. She buried her face in his arms. I won't let you look at anyone else. Tang Yu hugged that little thing and his heart softened, an indescribable feeling. After a long time, he said softly, Pei Chichi, don't look at anyone else, okay? She stared at him, and so did he. After a long time, they both laughed. Tang Yu, let's go eat skewers. She hugged his arm. Let's go eat rabbit. Tang Yu's expression was a little complicated. He coughed lightly and said, Chichi, are you sure you want to eat rabbit? I ate it with Amy and the others last time. It was especially delicious. The spicy bunny is the best. She swallowed her saliva as she spoke. Tang Yu looked at her with an infuriating gaze. Even if he didn't eat it, if she ate the bunny and he kissed her when they got back, it would be equivalent to him kissing the bunny's corpse. Thinking about it, Tang Yu sighed. In the past, Pei Chichi didn't eat these. Pei Chichi pulled him out of the cinema and pointed in a direction. There's a snack bar over there. It's delicious. Let's go eat. Tang Yu secretly made a decision. He would do it tonight. He would not kiss her. She would love him, but he would not soften his heart. It wasn't far, so they walked there. When crossing the road, he held her little hand as if he was holding a child. On the opposite side of the road, a black car was parked by the side of the road. Qin Anlan was sitting in the back seat, and Yi Liangqiu was next to him. The car window was lowered, and Qin Anlan's eyes were fixed on Tang Yu and Pei Chichi. Yi Liangqiu's voice was indifferent. They are a good match. Qin Anlan did not say anything, but his eyes were still on Pei Chichi. Most of her weight was leaning on Tang Yu. She looked very happy. Qin Anlan looked at them silently, took out a cigarette, lit it, and smoked slowly. Yi Liangqiu reminded him, "You just got out of the hospital. It doesn't matter." He smiled bitterly and was about to roll up the car window, but his eyes stopped. Because Pei Chichi saw him. Chapter 1164. Pei Chichi was stunned at first, then she ran over like a happy puppy. When she let go of Tang Yu's arm, Tang Yu felt a little melancholic and a little disappointed. And so did Yi Liangqiu. The relationship between Pei Chichi and Qin Anlan was very subtle. It was a special existence. No one could destroy it. Pei Chichi ran over. Before she reached them, Tang Yu had already walked over quickly and held her hand. "You're walking so fast. Don't you know how to be safe?" His tone was reprimanding, but it was also filled with endless affection. At least, Qin Anlan felt his teeth ache when he heard it. When he opened the car door and got out, Pei Chichi saw Yi Liangqiu. She thought to herself, now that they're together, it seems that what Anlan said about marriage is true. Pei Chichi waved her little paw at Yi Liangqiu and then looked at Qin Anlan. "You just got out of the hospital and you're already smoking?" Qin Anlan immediately threw the cigarette butt away and put it out with his calfskin shoes. Then, he looked up and looked at Pei Chichi. "Are you here to watch a movie?" "Yeah." Pei Chichi waved her little paw at Yi Liangqiu again. This time, Yi Liangqiu had to come out. She nodded at Tang Yu and said gently, "What do you think of it?" "It's my first time in an indie film." Pei Chichi was a little embarrassed because she had been sleeping the whole time. Fortunately, Tang Yu helped her out. She has a low tear threshold and kept crying with her head buried. She probably doesn't even know what she's watching. Yi Liangqiu's gaze landed on Pei Chichi's little face. After a while, she smiled and said, "I see. It's so beautiful. It's so touching." Pei Chichi clasped her little heart. Yi Liangqiu smiled and looked at Qin Anlan. "Then we'll go first. Mu Yun is still waiting for us at home." Qin Anlan had no objection. He held the car door and let Yi Liangqiu get in. After she got into the car, he got into the car himself. His gaze fell deeply on Pei Chichi's little face. That gaze made Tang Yu's heart ache. Pei Chichi waved her little paw again and watched their car leave. Tang Yu coughed lightly. "Bunny, do you still want to eat?" His mood now was quite complicated. He would rather she go to eat the rabbit than look at the rear of Qin Anlan's car like this. Pei Chichi turned around and held his hand. She said briskly, "Of course we're going to eat." She ran in front and he quickly followed behind. He shook his head. This foodie. She was the one who gave birth to Xiaoshan. That was not wrong at all. Tang Yu did not eat the rabbit meat here, but when he went back at night, he still tasted the spicy rabbit. He frowned. "Why do you like this taste so much?" Pei Chichi wrapped her arms around his and kissed him. "Should we change it to 5 spice next time?" He smiled helplessly and kissed her little mouth. After that, he wrapped his arms around her and kissed her again and again. When Pei Chichi left, he bit her little mouth and said in a low voice, "Chichi, I think I also like the taste of bunny. Let's eat together next time." She smiled and climbed into his arms. She kissed his thin lips and murmured, "Tang Yu, I want to turn you into spicy bunny." Finally, there was the spicy ham, indescribable. After that, Tang Yu patted her little head. "I forgive you for falling asleep while watching the movie. Actually, it was quite good." She was so energetic now that she had fallen asleep. However, in the end, Pei Chichi's expression was a little thought-provoking. Spicy bunny was not that delicious. Can you guess the reason? Chapter 1165. Early in the morning, the room was quiet and beautiful. Pei Chichi was in a deep sleep. Even Tang Yu slept a little later because of his newlywed indulgence. In such a quiet time, a little person hugged a small pillow and tiptoed into the room. Then, she decisively climbed onto the bed, lifted the quilt, and bravely crawled into the room. Xiaoshan was nestled in her parents' arms. She felt so happy. Her little belly rolled around, and after a roll, she pulled open her mother's bathrobe. Although Tang Yu had bathed Pei Chichi and it smelled good, Xiaoshen still smelled a fragrant smell. It was the smell of rabbit, a spicy smell. Xiaoshen took a few bites, and her expression was especially satisfied. Pei Chichi woke up from the pain. When she looked down, she saw a small black head. She smiled. Xiaoshen. Xiaoshen howled and reached out to hug her mother's neck. Pei Chichi hugged the little fellow and placed her hand on her little butt. She felt that it was chubby. This little fellow was really well taken care of. Hugging the little person, she was too sleepy and fell into a deep sleep. Xiaoshen was left there, baring her fangs and brandishing her claws. Xiaoshen wants to eat rabbit. Let's eat your father. He tastes better, Pei Chichi said in a daze, voicing out her inner thoughts. Xiaoshen raised her head. Her curly hair and round little face had a hint of confusion. Then, she crawled into her father's arms. Everywhere, there was the smell of spicy rabbit. Xiaoshen licked Tang Yu contentedly, like a puppy. When she kissed his lips, Tang Yu woke up. He thought it was Pei Chichi and was about to kiss her deeply. But when he opened his eyes, it was actually Xiaoshen. Tang Yu lay down and said in a soft voice, Xiaoshen, do you still want a younger brother or sister? Xiaoshen did not care about this. She happily licked him while calling out for spicy rabbit. Tang Yu lay down and let the puppy lick him. Then, he turned his face and looked at Pei Chichi. His lips curled up slightly. She, too, looked at him and smiled. At this moment, she was so happy. She gently placed her hand in his palm and gazed into his black eyes. After a long while, she softly said, What about Xiaoshen? Tang Yu closed his eyes and said impatiently, Let her eat it. She'll be well behaved in a while. She smiled and reached out to hold his hand. This time, she would not let go of him again. She would not make him wait again. Tang Yu, I love you, she mouthed. In fact, he had never told her, at least not after she lost her memory. However, she knew that he loved her very much, so she didn't mind telling him first. His pupils constricted, and then he ignored his little heart and turned sideways to hug Pei Chichi. He hugged her tightly. Chichi. She was obedient. Everything was perfect. She waved her little paw, bunny, bunny. Poor little girl. She did not know that she had been treated as a milk bunny by Yi Muyun. She had already become food and had to eat bunnies. In the end, she became a bunny brand milk bunny. Tang Yu hugged Pei Chichi and laughed hoarsely. His fingers reached out to rub Xiaoshen's hair. Pei Chichi frowned. She's so noisy. Tang Yu coughed lightly. You gave birth to her. You can't despise her. Pei Chichi also went to rub Xiaoshen's hair. Tang Yu suddenly took the checkbook from the bedside and wrote a set of numbers for her. 6 million. Chapter 1166. Pei Chichi let out a cry and buried herself in his arms. The little heart between them was squeezed into a flat heart. She stretched out her little paws with difficulty and waved them around. Tang Yu smiled and carried the little fellow out and kissed her forehead. Do you want a younger brother or sister? Xiaoshen nodded adorably. I want a younger sister. Tang Yu pondered for a moment. If you want a younger sister, Xiaoshen can go back to the room. Daddy will work hard to make a younger sister, okay? In the midst of its internal conflict, it took one last look at the two spicy bunnies. It hesitated for a long time between its sister and the spicy bunnies. Only then did its chubby little body crawl down and run out. It even considerately closed the door. As soon as the door was closed, Tang Yu pressed Pei Chichi down and said in a hoarse voice, Xiaoshen is so sensible. Shouldn't we work harder? Pei Chichi's long hair was loose and her little face was as white as a picture in the morning light. Her bathrobe had long been in a mess. She bit her finger and her eyes were filled with tears. It seems that you haven't used that. She was too embarrassed to say the word condom, because her shyness made her look particularly charming. Of course not. He had already had a vasectomy. He said that they were going to have a child, but he was just lying to her to do it with him all the time. Tang Yu responded casually and began to kiss her. His voice was a little deep. Chichi, let's have another child. She thought of Xiaoxin's cute appearance and wanted one in her heart. But, was she pregnant? He had done it so many times, but he had not used protection. However, it was always better to do it more, so Pei Xiaoqi was very cooperative. Tang Yu was very satisfied with the meal because he told her that she would easily get pregnant if she was on top of him. He coaxed her to sit on his waist. Pei Xiaoqi believed him and worked hard for an hour. In the end, she lay in his arms and breathed heavily. Tang Yu, do you think I'm pregnant now? Little fool. Tang Yu smiled and reached out to touch her. You didn't get pregnant this time. Try harder next time. He added, our Chichi can't give up. Pei Chichi hummed in agreement, looking very obedient. Tang Yu smiled and pulled her into his arms. Let's go shower together. Newlyweds must be indulgent, and he did it with her again in the bathroom. Pei Chichi suspected that he really had some kind of arousal disorder. So a week later, when Laro Khan told her to go to the mountainous area to collect the local scenery, Pei Chichi agreed with tears in her eyes. When she came back, she told Tang Yu. Tang Yu was sitting on the sofa flipping through some documents. He looked up at her and asked casually, what about me? Pei Chichi knelt beside him, her voice trembling. What should we do? Tang Yu put down the magazine and reached out to hold her sharp little chin. He smiled. If you leave, what about our sex life at night? Pei Chichi was stunned. She looked around and saw several servants preparing dinner in the dining room. She lowered her head and bit his finger angrily. You do it yourself. Anyway, he used to do it this way. Then, she clenched her little fist. Tang Yu, as a successful man, you shouldn't think about this all the time. He let go of her and began to casually flip through the magazine with a very calm expression. Chapter 1167. Sure enough, her unscrupulous businessman had only flipped 2 pages when he looked up and said seriously, it's because I'm successful in my career that I'm pursuing other things. For example, should I work harder because I have too few children? Pei Chichi couldn't refute him at all. She clenched her fists and glared at him. Tang Yu smiled again and said calmly, you've been gone for so long, 2 weeks. Chichi, what do you think I should do? How can I get pregnant alone? Pei Chichi squeezed out 2 words from between her teeth. Unscrupulous businessman. Tang Yu chuckled. You can go, but you can come back to make up for it. Come back to make up for it. Pei Chichi really admired Tang Yu for being able to make such a shameless thing sound so reasonable. She waved her little fists and said weakly, pregnant. Doing it once a day is enough. But he forced her to do it 2 or 3 times a day. If she came back to make up for it in half a month, how many times would she have to do it every night? Did she still want to sleep? Pei Chichi really felt that marrying Tang Yu was like being in deep trouble. It was so tiring. How about this? I'll go with you guys. It won't affect the birth of the child. You can do your job during the day and I'll do mine at night, he suggested kindly. Pei Chichi thought about it. Forget it. Everyone's tent wasn't soundproof. If he didn't rest for the night, how would she be able to see him in the future? She glared at him for a long time before she snorted softly. I'd better come back to make up for it. She always felt a little dejected. She felt that her status with Tang Yu was too low and that she was humiliating the country. Tang Yu smiled and reached out to touch her little face. Chichi, I'll wait for you to come back. Having said that, Big Boss continued to read the magazine. Pei Chichi clenched her little hands. Why do you still have such a long marriage leave when you're in charge of 3 companies? You can ask for it too. But are you sure you want to apply for marriage leave? Tang Yu smiled again. Marriage leave is very tiring. This is my experience. Pei Chichi howled again and fell into his arms. Her voice was a little soft. Tang Yu, can I return it? He sat on the sofa, his fingers gently twirling around her hair. He was especially gentle. Chichi, is it that easy to take my money? Pei Chichi slumped to the ground, cursing all 8 generations of Laro Khan's ancestors in her heart. Tang Yu smiled and brought her to dinner. Xiaoxin is not here tonight, eat more. Pei Chichi was already familiar with his tricks. She clenched her fists. She was not going to sleep tonight. Looking at her indignant expression, Tang Yu smiled. Chichi, do you really feel that bad? I remember when you were excited, you would beg me not to end it. She buried herself in his arms and couldn't listen to him anymore. Unexpectedly, this night, he didn't torture her like before. Instead, he just gave it to her gently for a long time, about 2 hours. It was very gentle. His eyes were so gentle that they almost dripped water, and his movements were even more gentle. He kissed her, praised her, and whispered words of love in her ear. That night, Pei Chichi was a little immersed. It felt like a wedding night. Although she didn't indulge herself too much, she still went to bed very late because he hugged her and said a lot. Chapter 1168. Early the next morning, when Pei Chichi woke up, Tang Yu was already gone. But there was a slight sound in the living room. She got out of bed and walked out barefoot. Xiao Ran came early in the morning with 2 secretaries. She was talking to Tang Yu. This is not bad. It tastes good. Xiao Ran said professionally, Chichi should be able to eat it for 3 days. Tang Yu reached out and took out another kind. Have you confirmed the manufacturer of this spicy rabbit? Is it safe? Xiao Ran held back his laughter. Safe. Absolutely safe. The 2 secretaries also had a hard time holding back. Pei Chichi went out for a walk and their boss acted as if it was his own child going to a summer camp. But thinking about it, he must have been so careful because he had lost it once. Xiao Ran counted the food that Pei Chichi was going to take away. There was a total of 10 kilograms in a big backpack. Pei Chichi was at the door. I can't carry it. Tang Yu looked back at her. After making sure that she was dressed properly, he said lightly, Don't you have Larocan? Xiao Ran nodded at Pei Chichi. Then we'll go first. Chichi, have a good half a month. Looking at the poor child's face, it was obvious that she had indulged herself too much. She must be very happy to leave the clutches of her boss. Pei Chichi nodded. Thank you. Let's go for coffee when we come back. Xiao Ran smiled and went out with Secretary 2 and Secretary 3. At the door, Secretary 2 couldn't help but say, Boss really dotes on Pei Chichi. He treats her like a child. Xiao Ran agreed. Actually, Chichi is quite good like this. Boss likes her no matter what. Secretary 3 told the truth. Her looks have always been good. Look at her. She has always been like this. And this time, she looks even more girlish. The 3 of them looked at each other with an indescribable tacit understanding. In the living room, Pei Chichi was sitting. She opened her bag and looked at this and that. She was quite happy. They were all her favorite foods. However, Larocan was suffering. It must be very heavy to carry 20 catties of things. Chichi, have fun. Tang Yu leaned over and kissed her. Go get changed and have breakfast. I'll take you there later. Pei Chichi nodded. After washing up, she went downstairs. Tang Yu was already sitting there. For the first time, he didn't read the newspaper. Instead, he fed Pei Xiaoqi and sent him out. There were more than 10 people in the group, but only Pei Chichi had a parent send her off. She was ridiculed for a long time. That was the itinerary. They drove all the way to Zhongqing, parked the car at the foot of the mountain, and hiked up. The mountain took half a day. With Larocan taking care of her, Tang Yu was not worried. He was just worried that she would not be used to her delicate skin. Larocan silently looked at the bag in Tang Yu's hand. He silently took it and made a gesture of 2 million for 1 carry. Tang Yu exchanged a look with him. It was a deal. Pei Chichi got into Larocan's car. Tang Yu stood and watched the car drive away. After a while, his Chichi leaned against the window and waved her little paws at him. Tang Yu, wait for me to come back, make up for it. Even before they left, she was already starting to miss him. Pei Chichi was such a good-for-nothing. Tang Yu smiled. He put one hand in his pocket and waved the other at her. He sighed in his heart. It was like his own child was on a trip. He always missed her. Chapter 1169. Pei Chichi glanced at him. Old Khan, now I know why you and Tang Yu get along so well. Because they were equally frivolous and shameless. Old Khan just smiled. He probably understood what she meant. After driving for more than an hour, Pei Chichi was almost done with what she wanted to say. She was a little sleepy and wanted to sleep. Old Khan took a sip of Red Bull and said in a rough voice, "Sleep for a while. It's a long way. We still have 8 to 9 hours to reach Sungcheng." Pei Chichi lay down, but she couldn't fall asleep. She took out her phone and sent a message to Tang Yu. "What are you guys doing?" The other side immediately replied. They were giving Xiaoshan a bath. She had a poop just now and it was very smelly. Pei Chichi laughed. She suddenly missed them very much. She had a feeling that she wanted to drive the car back, but that would be very spineless. She thought about it and gave up. Pei Chichi chatted with Tang Yu for a while. Sometimes he replied quickly, and sometimes only once every 10 minutes. He was probably blowing on Xiaoxin's hair. After chatting for a long time, Pei Chichi fell asleep. She hugged her phone and slept soundly. When they passed by a red light, Old Khan leaned over and took her phone. He sent a voice message. "She's asleep." These 4 simple words made Tang Yu's heart feel very comfortable. He smiled. Xiaoshan was very demanding to help his little girl braid her hair. As a father, he didn't have much experience, so it was still ugly after a long time. Xiaoshan suddenly burst into tears. Her cries were earth-shattering, as if it was a very big deal. But for a little girl, it was a big deal. Tang Yu took a long time to coax her. His heart was sweet and sour at the same time. He turned around and listened to Old Khan's words, as if Pei Chichi was by his side. Xiaoxin's delicate little face was as delicate as a painting. She blinked her watery eyes and asked Tang Yu, "When will Mama come back?" "About 10 days, Tang Yu said and sighed. He was a newlywed man, and he had only been with her for a few days. Before he tasted her, she had already left. This lass must have wanted to leave long ago. Tang Yu smiled helplessly and hugged Xiaoshan. "Daddy will take you to eat ice." The little girl with the ugly pigtails clapped her hands. "Yes, yes. Daddy is the best." In the end, Tang Yu went to the ice room with his little heart. There, he met Yi Liangqiu and Yi Muyun by chance. It was rare that little Mu Yun was not hospitalized. He was sitting in the ice room. When he saw Xiaoshan, his eyes brightened. "Originally, we were very happy, but when we saw Yi Muyun, we were so scared that tears welled up in our eyes." Our plump little body twisted on Tang Yu's shoulder, and our little but-faced Yi Muyun, Xiaoshan, didn't want to be eaten. Tang Yu's heart softened. He was amused and angry at the same time. He reached out and patted his little daughter. "Cher, how can you do this?" Yi Muyun's eyes lit up again. So little Munchin's name was Cher, not Xiaoshan. Shuer was quite pleasant to the ears. It was as if she was placed in his mouth and melted like snow. In short, Yi Muyun always thought of eating. It was rare that Xiaoshan didn't listen to Tang Yu. She twisted her little body and ignored him for a long time. Chapter 1170. Tang Yu also nodded slightly, and with Xiaoshan, he sat in another seat. Since Pei Chichi wasn't here, he definitely wouldn't have too much contact with other women. Even if he knew them, according to Tang Yu's personality, he wouldn't sit together with them. Xiaoshan was quite happy, and faced Yi Muyun, who was a few tables away. Oh, come and eat me." "You can't eat me." Yi Muyun looked at the little heart that was grinning from ear to ear and smiled faintly. She was young, but her little face had calmness and calmness beyond her age. Tang Yu's heart was bleeding. Why did he and Chichi give birth to such a silly and sweet child? Xiaoshan was conquered by the delicacies, and she ate very happily. And Yi Muyun looked at the way she ate with relish, and smiled slightly again. "Eat more, and the more you eat, the faster you grow. When you grow up, you can eat it all in one bite." As Xiaoshan ate, she peeked at Yi Muyun. His gaze was really scary, and Xiaoshan started crying as she ate. "Papa, he wants to eat me." Tang Yu's gaze swept across the little radish head opposite him. As a man, he keenly captured Yi Muyun's interest in Xiaoshan. The corner of Tang Yu's mouth slightly hooked up into a faint smile, and he said calmly, "How could that be? He wants to eat the dessert in your little bowl." Xiaoshan blinked her teary eyes. "Really?" Tang Yu smiled. "Really?" He looked at Yi Muyun with a warning. "Boy, if you want to chase after my little girl, come back in 15 years. Under his stern gaze, little Muyun actually didn't shrink back, but looked straight at him. The gazes of an adult and a child met in the air, igniting a flame, and finally returning to calmness. Yi Muyun looked at Yi Liangqiu and said calmly, "Mom, let's go first. Dr. Zhong is going to check on you later." This child is so calm that he doesn't look like a 7-year-old child. Yi Liangqiu is gratified and a little sad. She nods and asks the assistant to pack a dessert similar to Xiaoxin's. She thinks that Muyun looks at Xiaoxin because he wants to eat the same kind of dessert as Xiaoxin. Until they left, Xiaoxin nestled in her father's arms, tears still lingering in her eyes. "This little brother is so scary. Every time I see him, I cry. Be careful not to be eaten." Tang Yu was amused. He reached out and stroked his daughter's hair. His voice was a little hoarse. "With Daddy here, he wouldn't dare to eat Xiaoxin." Xiaoxin blinked. "Really? Of course it's real." Tang Yu patiently wiped the little girl's mouth clean and said in a gentle voice, "How about we go to Grandma's house to play later?" Xiaoxin suddenly became happy again. "Zhao Yang is much cuter than the little brother just now." Tang Yu smiled. "That's because little Zhao Yang doesn't want to eat you." He brought Xiaoxin to Lin Yun's place. The two children had a good time. Tang Yu chatted with his mother. Because Zhao Yi was not around, the mother and son were even more carefree. Lin Yun said somewhat reproachfully, "You didn't bring Chichi with you when you just got married." She gave birth to a total of 2 children. One was Tang Yu, and the other was little Zhao Yang. Both were male. Chichi and Xiaoxin were now the same. Lin Yun raised them like daughters. When she heard that they were going to the mountainous area of Zhongqing, Lin Yun glanced at Tang Yu. "She's so delicate and expensive. How can you bear to let her go to the mountains?" Chapter 1171. Chichi had been with him since she was 20 years old and had been living a tense life. As long as she was happy now, he was willing to give her freedom. Lin Yun glanced at him and didn't say anything. Her son was willing. What else could she say? Tang Yu left by himself in the afternoon, leaving Xiaoxin at his mother's place for a few days. On the other hand, he drove his car back to the rose garden. He went upstairs to get a suitcase and put it in an off-road vehicle. He also changed into a set of casual clothes and sports shoes. Wearing sunglasses, he got in the car and drove in the direction of Zhongqing. 8 o'clock in the evening, Zhongqing. Old Khan got out of the car and asked Pei Chichi to come down too. At this time, they were at the foot of the mountain. The twilight reflected the last glimmer of the setting sun. Old Khan tilted his head and looked at her. "Every time I come here, I feel very far away from the hustle and bustle of the city. I feel very calm." Pei Chichi looked up at the setting sun on the other side of the mountain and shouted, "Zhongqing, I'm coming." Old Khan laughed, took out 2 wrinkled cigarettes from his pocket and handed one to Pei Chichi. "Do you want one?" Pei Chichi looked at him. Old Khan laughed. "Are you afraid that Tang Yu will criticize you?" She snorted. "Of course not." Old Khan didn't force her. He lit a cigarette and slowly took a puff before saying, "Pei Huan used to smoke. Huai Kanxing used to smoke, but she stopped after she got pregnant. After a long time, she quit." When he said this, his eyes fell on Pei Chichi's face. There was something deep in his eyes. That was Old Khan's story. Pei Chichi looked at Old Khan, put her hand on his shoulder and leaned against his side. "It's good that you quit." She smiled. Old Khan also smiled and stroked her hair. "Yes, it's good that you quit." He was talking about Sumo. Sumo was a shadow in his life that couldn't be erased, a secret that he didn't know, and a ray of moonlight hidden in his heart. It had been so long that he had forgotten what he should have forgotten. But occasionally, his heart would still ache. However, he could not tell Pei Huan about this. However, Pei Chichi understood. Although she had forgotten everything, Pei Chichi looked at Laro Khan and smiled. Are we staying at the foot of the mountain tonight? Old Khan nodded and pointed to the flat ground on the side. Set up camp there. There were more than 20 people in their group, and they set up more than 10 tents. Laro Khan arranged for Pei Chichi and the two girls to stay together. The men worked while the women chatted and took pictures of the scenery at the foot of the mountain. The other two girls were both photography enthusiasts, his girlfriends. When they sat together in the tent, they looked at Pei Chichi's bag of snacks and were stunned. Did she need to eat so many snacks in the past 10 days? One of them said unhappily, Old Khan, you have to carry it to death. If his Pei Huan finds out, she will definitely be very unhappy. His words revealed his closeness with Pei Huan. After all, Khan Mingzhu was quite famous, and Pei Huan was rich, so many girls fawned over them. Pei Chichi smiled. I don't think so. Although she said that she had forgotten everything, Pei Huan looked at her with an expression like a puppy looking at a piece of meat. She was very emotional. The other girl spoke up for the first girl. Any woman would be unhappy to see another woman ordering her husband around. Chapter 1172. Therefore, the way they looked at Pei Chichi was different. Pei Chichi wasn't a fool, so she could naturally feel it. Since they didn't like her, then, she pulled her bag and said with a smile, it's fine if you don't like it. Those two were dumbfounded. They didn't say they didn't like it. Pei Chichi lay on her little bed, playing with her phone and nibbling on the rabbit. Those two were so hungry that they swallowed their saliva, but there was nothing they could do. From that moment on, they decided to exclude Pei Chichi, and they even secretly sent a message to Pei Huan, taking a photo of Pei Chichi for her. Sister Huan, you have to be careful. Pei Huan replied, ha ha ha, that's impossible. If it was possible, then Pei Chichi must be blind. Tang Yu was such a superb man. No matter how Old Khan looked at him, there was no way he could compare. However, those two didn't think so. They thought that Pei Huan must have been deceived by Pei Chichi. They had to find a way to expose Pei Chichi's true colors, so that Sister Huan wouldn't be taken advantage of. Therefore, the rest of the trip was subtle. Every 2 nights, they entered the mountains on foot. Old Khan carried Pei Chichi's 10-kilogram bag, but he wasn't carrying the bag now, but the 2 million he had earned. Pei Chichi followed him. Sometimes, when they went up the mountain, Old Khan would even carry her for a while. Others didn't know about their relationship, and those two saw it and took a photo for Pei Huan. Sister Huan, look, your Old Khan is carrying her, how can there be nothing? Pei Huan saw it and laughed. In the past, Old Khan and Pei Chichi lived together, so what? But later, Pei Huan and Old Khan lived together, and because they were so crowded out, even the men could see it. Pei Chichi, on the other hand, was happy. She could just ignore it. However, Laro Khan couldn't bear to see her suffer, so he grabbed her to stay with him and didn't avoid people. Chichi was his little disciple and Pei Huan's younger sister. She was a few months older than Pei Huan, so it wasn't a big deal. Besides, they didn't have to worry about anything in the wild. Pei Chichi was also reassured to stay in the same tent as Old Khan, but she first sent a message to Pei Huan, do you mind? Pei Huan waved her hand generously. Go ahead and sleep. Pei Chichi lay on the small bed, laughing uncontrollably. Old Khan took a shower outside and returned to the tent. He put on some clothes and dried his hair. What are you laughing at? Pei Chichi took out a bag of dried fish from her bag. Pei Huan asked me to give you something to eat. This is for you. Old Khan took a look and swallowed a bag of dried fish in one gulp. So little. Do you think I'm a kitten? Pei Chichi laughed. Eat sparingly. Before going to bed, she poured out the snacks in her bag and carefully organized them, as if she was organizing some treasure. She then looked at the 2 big bottles of milk at the side and touched them carefully. These were all the love that Old Khan had given her. Time to sleep. She hugged her dried fish, Spicy Bunny, and slept soundly. Old Khan went outside for a smoke and reported the day's schedule to his wife, especially mentioning that he and Chichi slept together. Pei Huan was very generous. I believe in my husband. Suddenly, Old Khan was a little touched. Chapter 1173. Old Khan threw away the cigarette butt and wanted to go back to the tent to sleep. Suddenly, Old Khan's eyes stared blankly. He saw the rocks rolling down from the top of the mountain, slowly at first, then pouring down in torrents. His lips moved and then he shouted, "The mountain is collapsing." His voice was especially clear in the dark, like the wailing of ghosts and howling of wolves in the valley, echoing one after another. The sound of death was getting closer and closer. It was too late to run. Instead, they would be buried under the rocks. Old Khan quickly went into the tent and shook Pei Chichi awake. "Chichi, there's a landslide." Pei Chichi was still a little groggy. Old Khan had already lifted the 2 large wooden planks from the ground and snapped them in half with both hands. The 4 pieces were put together to form a simple nest. He quickly pulled Pei Chichi to lie down with him and dragged her snack bag and 2 large bottles of milk over. Just as they lay down, a loud sound came from above, accompanied by a huge pressure. First, the tent was crushed mercilessly, and then it sank down to the thick wooden planks below. Old Khan had thrown Pei Chichi under him. Pei Chichi only heard a muffled groan from him. Darkness slowly descended in front of them. Finally, the last ray of light was swallowed up. They were surrounded by rubble, leaving only this small space supported by Old Khan. Old Khan? Her voice was a little shaky. She was afraid that something had happened to him. Old Khan heaved a heavy sigh. "I'm fine." He lowered his head and rubbed his chin against Pei Chichi's head. "Chichi, are you okay?" Pei Chichi grunted in response. Then she wanted to move, but she couldn't. Her voice was very soft. "Old Khan, are we going to die here?" "No," Old Khan said in a hoarse voice. In fact, he wasn't sure himself. He only knew that he had to hold on until the arrival of help. As long as he was alive, he wouldn't let anything happen to Chichi. In this small world, including the edges and corners, he estimated that there was about 7 to 8 hours of oxygen for them. If there were no gaps between the rocks, they would probably suffocate to death. Laro Khan wouldn't tell Pei Chichi about this. Sometimes, a person's desire to live would weaken after despair. Laro Khan asked softly, "Chichi, do you still have your bag?" Pei Chichi could move her hands. She grabbed the bag and said, "The bag is still here. There's milk too." Laro Khan was slightly relieved and rubbed his chin against her again. "Chichi, hold on. Someone will definitely come to save us." They didn't know the situation outside. This place was like a lost world, and they couldn't see it at all. It was already very uncomfortable for Pei Chichi to lie down like this. She knew that Old Khan would be in even more pain. She was a little worried about him. "Old Khan, can you move?" Laro Khan snorted. "Chichi, it's fine. I can't move. If I move, we'll probably be squashed into meat patties." The wooden planks he had set up were at an ingenious angle. If he moved now, it would probably all collapse. Pei Chichi bit her lip. "Are you in pain?" "A little." He smiled. "I'm fine." As the two spoke, they couldn't hear the sounds outside. Old Khan secretly sensed that there was an air current coming in. He knew in his heart that God was merciful and didn't completely block this place. Chapter 1174. If the stones were to fall again, they might not be able to escape. Fortunately, there were occasional stones, but they were not concentrated. The surroundings gradually quietened down. It was late at night, and Pei Chichi was a little sleepy, but she did not dare to sleep. At this moment, she missed Tang Yu very much. If she died, she would never be able to see them again. Old Khan's voice was hoarse but gentle. "Chichi, sleep for a while. I'll wake you up at dawn." Pei Chichi looked around. It was dark. "How will we know when dawn arrives?" Old Khan forced a smile. "Chichi, hang in there. I'll know when dawn arrives." She was so tired that she fell asleep in Old Khan's arms. But how could she really fall asleep? The occasional stones were enough to wake her up. Even after waking up, Old Khan was still awake. She slept intermittently until dawn, when a ray of light shone through the cracks of the stones. At that time, Old Khan was really relieved. He heaved a long sigh of relief and looked down at Chichi. From his angle, he could only see her little black head. He called out softly, "Chichi?" Pei Chichi woke up and responded with a millimeter. "Chichi, can you open the bag with your hands? If you can, open the bag and take out 2 bags of snacks." Old Khan panted as he spoke, and his body trembled. His teeth hurt. Pei Chichi's little hand reached over. Her body was pinned down by Old Khan, and she could only move her arm slightly. Just like that, she slowly pulled the zipper open and took out 2 small bags from within. "Be careful with your strength. Too much vibration will cause the stones above to fall down," Old Khan said softly, and then he rubbed her little head with his bearded chin to give her some courage. Pei Chichi responded with a millimeter and tore the bag open carefully. She tried her best to reach for the snacks and fed them to Old Khan. It was quite difficult, but Old Khan still managed to eat them. He was only willing to eat 1 bag before letting her eat. "I don't know how many days we'll be stuck here. Let's eat sparingly," he said gruffly, then looked down at her nibbling like a little mouse. After he finished eating, he felt that his stamina had improved a little. Laro Khan gestured for her to open the milk bottle and took out a straw from his backpack. Both of them drank quite a lot. "This bottle can last for 2 days, so let's drink as much as we can." Old Khan calculated that 2 bottles could last them for 4 days. If Tang Yu came in time, they might be saved in 3 days. He could not help but feel lucky. If he was not with Chichi, he might not have the confidence to be rescued. After Pei Chichi finished drinking, she asked Laro Khan softly after a while, "I need to go to the toilet. What should I do?" Laro Khan had been holding it in for a while. When he heard her question, he coughed and said, "Chichi, why don't we each take a step back? I won't despise you and you won't despise me. How about that?" Pei Chichi let out a cry and continued to nibble on the mud. "Old Khan, do we really have to do this?" Seeing her like this, Old Khan laughed in a deep voice. Only Chichi could make him laugh at this moment. "Otherwise, what should we do? Our kidneys will be damaged if we hold it in and will be crippled when we get out." They still had something to eat and milk to drink, but the others might not be so lucky. It would be good if half of them could survive. At the thought of this, Old Khan's eyes dimmed a little. Chapter 1175. Pei Chichi saw that he did not say anything and thought for a while. Finally, she closed her eyes, gritted her teeth, and went to the toilet. Old Khan did not stand on ceremony with her. After a while, Pei Chichi cried out, "Old Khan, you're really a lazy person with a lot of shit and urine." Old Khan's voice was deep and he coughed a little, feeling a little uncomfortable. "Don't ever mention this again, lass," he reminded her. Pei Chichi was not stupid. She would never mention this. Even if she did, she would feel disgusted. The 2 of them fell silent for a while. Pei Chichi pounded the ground with her little hands. "It stinks." She was smelly by herself. Old Khan was also a little embarrassed. The 2 of them rested for a while and listened to the movements outside. About half an hour later, there would be a rock rolling past them. Every time, it would just barely roll over their heads. It was very thrilling. "Old Khan, do you think we'll be buried here?" she asked worriedly. Old Khan was not sure either. After all, this mountain was so big, and it would take a few days to dig it all out. He rubbed her head with his chin. "Lass, if I knew this would happen, I wouldn't have asked you to come." Old Khan felt a little guilty. Pei Chichi shook her head. "Luckily, I'm here with you, right?" Old Khan laughed. "Yes, just like how we used to do, we'll all be together." Pei Chichi was very grateful to Old Khan. At this time, he could still give her warmth and make her feel less afraid. She nodded softly and did not say anything else after that. She lay down and rested. It was not until she could not stand the hunger anymore that she opened the snack bag and reluctantly took out a few bags of rabbit buns and shared them with Old Khan. She gave Old Khan a big bag of buns and ate a small bag for herself. After eating, she drank some milk to ensure her strength. It was very uncomfortable to be pressed down like this for a long time. Old Khan suddenly moved his body up by about a centimeter. Chichi, try stretching your body. Just a little movement will do. Pei Chichi did not dare to move as she was afraid that the rock would fall if she moved. Don't worry, I'm here to support you. If you don't move for a long time, your bones will die, he said calmly. Pei Chichi only moved a little before she didn't dare to move anymore. She obediently lay down because she knew that if she moved a little, Laro Khan would have to expend a lot of energy. Laro Khan also carefully moved a little, but he only dared to move a little before he continued to lie on her back. Sometimes, when she was afraid, he would rub his chin against her little head and tell her that it was okay. He would tell her what time it was. Her phone rang a few times. The ringtone was from Tang Yu, but it only rang a few times before it stopped. The signal was probably bad. Both she and Old Khan were expecting it to ring again, but it never did. The sky darkened, and the sky brightened again. 12 hours, 24 hours, 48 hours. Just like that, time flew by. Although there was milk and food, he was getting weaker and weaker as he lay there all the time. Pei Chichi's head was drooping down. Old Khan had asked her to get snacks a few times too. He was a little anxious and kept rubbing his beard against her. Pei Chichi woke up and said softly, "Old Khan?" Old Khan replied, "Yes, Chichi. Can you still move?" She said yes and went to get it. But the moment her hand touched it, there was a sound of a rock rolling over her head. The wooden board above her head broke and pressed down on top of her head. Old Khan tried to resist it but to no avail. Instead, his arm was broken. Chapter 1176. Pei Chichi felt a wave of pain, and then her mind was in a mess. Various scenes flashed past her mind like a movie rewinding. Tang Yu, I'm sorry, I can't love you. Pei Chichi, do you still feel pain? Who was the owner of that pair of painful eyes? She shook her head, and her mind was in a mess. However, more uncontrollable images appeared in her mind, and that voice was especially clear. Chichi, we're siblings. Tang Yu, I only want to be with you. I don't care if we're siblings or not, I only want you, I only want our child. I beg you, let her stay. Who was she pleading to? Was it her who was experiencing such a painful past? She wanted to hug her head, but she could not move at all. It was so painful that it was hard to breathe. It was not physical, but physical. Finally, there was a close-up of that pair of eyes. She retreated, and he wanted to pull her back. Chichi, don't go. She did not want to go, she did not want to go at all. She still wanted to stay and see who he was, however, she could not hold on any longer, and her body slumped to the ground. Laro Khan kept calling her name by her ear, but she did not respond to him anymore. Because of the rocks earlier, the last trace of light in this small world was blocked, and the air was getting thinner. Old Khan knew that if they could not be saved in another 2 to 3 hours, they would probably spend the rest of their lives in this place. At the foot of the mountain, Tang Yu had not slept for 2 days and 2 nights. His usually calm eyes were bloodshot. Meng Qingcheng and Xiao Ran rushed over. At this moment, he did not trust anyone, and they were the only ones who could understand what he meant. The whole mountain was buried by rocks, and he did not know where his Chichi was buried. He had taken the helicopter and circled the mountain countless times, but he could not find any trace of her. He did not dare to move recklessly, because if he were to flip the rocks with such a huge commotion, it might cause another large-scale landslide, and that would destroy his Chichi's last hope. Flip back a little more. He stared at the screen with his bloodshot eyes. Meng Qingcheng scrolled to the front of the screen, slowly locked on and zoomed in. Tang Yu's gaze froze, and his breathing became erratic. He saw Laro Khan's license plate. Old Khan's car was buried and overturned, but half of the license plate was exposed. He remembered that number. Before leaving, Pei Chichi pointed at Laro Khan's license plate and said, Tang Yu, look. Laro Khan's license plate is so funny. 588. Pei Huan must have asked him to do it. Tang Yu immediately strode out. Prepare 2 helicopters. Pei Huan was also there. She stepped forward with tears in her eyes and grabbed Tang Yu's sleeve. I want to go too. In the past 2 days, Pei Huan had lost a lot of weight and looked haggard. Laro Khan was her husband, and Chichi was her sister. She couldn't lose two family members at the same time. Tang Yu's gaze was fixed on her face for 2 seconds. Finally, he reached out and put his arm around her shoulder. "Let's go." Pei Huan wanted to cry. She followed Tang Yu into the helicopter, while Meng Qingcheng and Xiao Ran boarded the other one. Just as they were about to take off, the relevant authorities came to stop them. The higher-ups have instructed that this mountain cannot be taken lightly. On one hand, it's dangerous, and on the other hand, it will cause a disturbance. Tang Yu did not stop. He boarded the helicopter and looked at the people in uniform below. "If you're so capable, shoot my helicopter down." The people looked at each other. How would they dare to do that? If anything happened to Mr. Tang, they wouldn't be able to compensate with their lives. Chapter 1177. Since they didn't dare to do so, they could only watch as the two helicopters rose into the sky. Tang Yu and Meng Qingcheng personally piloted the helicopter. He switched on the satellite phone and dialed a number somewhere. "Send 20 more helicopters. I need excavation equipment. Do everything you can to transfer them over." Old Khan and Pei Chichi weren't the only ones buried in the mountain. Therefore, if they wanted to dig, they couldn't go down the mountain. They could only transport the equipment from the sky. After hanging up the phone, they drove to their destination according to the previous aerial photos. When they saw Old Khan's license plate, Tang Yu's heart was in turmoil. Pei Huan's eyes were filled with tears. "It's Old Khan's car," Pei Huan murmured. She grabbed Tang Yu's arm and pinched it a little too deeply. Tang Yu's voice was a little heavy. "Have you ever camped with Old Khan?" Pei Huan wiped her tears. "A few times." "Does he have any habit of camping?" Tang Yu's helicopter hovered in the sky, looking for the best landing spot. Pei Huan thought carefully before saying, "He seems to camp 10 steps to the left of his car. When he goes to the toilet, he uses his car to block the way." Tang Yu looked at the location and saw a small protrusion. His eyes were bloodshot and there was a taste of blood in his mouth. That could be his chichi. As expected, the helicopter landed on a relatively flat area. He got down and pulled Pei Huan down as well. Step by step, they carefully stepped on the stones. They were afraid that her Old Khan and his chichi were below. Meng Qingcheng and Xiao Ran also alighted from the helicopter. Xiao Ran walked carefully to Tang Yu. Meng Qingcheng was in charge of contacting 20 helicopters. Tang Yu walked to the small pile and pursed his lips. He saw a corner of the tent's fabric. After the catastrophe, it had turned grey. He took out his phone and dialed Pei Chichi's number. Her phone was still switched off, but he could feel that Chichi was right below. He felt an indescribable pain in his heart. He turned to look at Meng Qingcheng, who was walking over. How much longer until they arrive? No matter how anxious he was, he could not easily move these stones, because every movement could be fatal to Chichi. If she was still alive, Meng Qingcheng held onto his phone. "We'll be there in 10 minutes. As he spoke, he was calm and collected, giving Tang Yu a sense of security. Right now, he needed a partner like Qingcheng. Pei Huan couldn't control herself anymore and burst into tears. "Khan Mingzhu, listen carefully. If you dare to die, I will dare to remarry." The scene was silent. Suddenly, a cracking sound came from a crack in the stone. Although it was small, it truly existed. "They're alive." Pei Huan was crying and laughing at the same time. She pulled Tang Yu's arm. "Tang Yu, they're alive. Khan Mingzhu, Pei Chichi, you bad girl, listen carefully. Hang in there. If you dare to die, I will marry Tang Yu. Do you hear me?" Pei Huan wiped her tears and smiled. The scene became even quieter. Pei Huan's way of motivating people was really special. Tang Yu said in a deep voice, "Chichi, I'm coming." More sounds could be heard from inside, even his eyes were brimming with tears. He had never been so excited before. His Chichi was really still alive. In the sky, there was a series of helicopters circling around, coming closer and closer, One by one, the helicopters landed. There were search and rescue experts and even search and rescue dogs. There were a total of 40 people. Chapter 1178. The leading expert looked at the situation and studied the direction in which the stones were stacked. Someone must have done something to hold up these stones. We need to move the stones from these directions to avoid hurting the people inside. If we're not wrong, they should be below. Tang Yu hesitated for a moment and looked at him. Let's do it, he said decisively, but the expert was still cautious. If anything happened to the people below, he would definitely not end up well. That was Mr. Tang's wife. They couldn't afford it even if they had dozens of lives. The most advanced equipment was very light and dexterous, almost like the arms of a robot. It easily moved the stones away one by one. There were a total of 5 robotic arms working, so it was very fast. About 10 minutes later, the stones on top were moved away, and the scene inside was slowly revealed. When she saw the following scene, Pei Huan covered her mouth. Old Khan's whole back was covered in blood, and the white t-shirt he was wearing was dyed red. He was lying there, holding Pei Chichi tightly. Even though there was nothing above him, he didn't move at all. Pei Chichi was lying under Old Khan's body, motionless. Around them, there were overturned milk bottles and an opened bag of snacks. Mingzhu. Chichi. Pei Huan called out softly, but she didn't dare to move forward, for fear that she would step on the stones and crush them. Tang Yu went down almost instantly and helped Meng Qingcheng carry Old Khan to the stretcher. Although he was seriously injured, he was still conscious. There are about 10 tents on the left, he said weakly. Chichi hit her head a few hours ago, and she hasn't woken up since. But I touched her, she's alive. As he spoke, Pei Huan kept nodding her head, laughing and crying at the same time. Our Old Khan is the best. She wanted to hug him, but she was afraid of hurting him. At this time, Tang Yu had carefully picked up Pei Chichi. She was fine, except for a bruise on her forehead. She was in a mess and even smelled of urine, but in Tang Yu's eyes, she was an angel. He kissed her forehead, put his face close to hers, and said in a low voice, Chichi, I'll never let you leave me again. Tang Yu took them to the helicopter and went directly to Zhengcheng Hospital. Meng Qingcheng stayed behind to rescue the other photographers, and Xiao Ran also stayed behind. Zhengcheng Hospital. After the examination, Pei Chichi's body was fine, and there was no problem with the electrocardiogram. Old Khan woke up after a few hours of sleep. But Pei Chichi didn't wake up. Like a sleeping princess, she slept in Zhengcheng Hospital for 3 days. For the past 3 days, Tang Yu was mentally and physically exhausted. In the end, he flew Chichi and Old Khan back to B City. Shengyuan Hospital. Tang Yu had arranged for Laro Khan and Pei Chichi to stay in the room next door. While he was guarding Pei Chichi, Old Khan was supported by Pei Huan to visit Pei Chichi. Seeing that she was still asleep, Old Khan shook his head. This girl must be too lazy to get up. Tang Yu sat there, his fingers gently touching Pei Chichi's little face. She might be too tired. His heart ached when he dug up the stone, but he also knew that if it weren't for Old Khan, his Chichi might not be here anymore. Only Old Khan and Chichi survived from the group of more than 20 people. Chapter 1179. When he learned that so many people had been killed, Old Khan had cried, while Tang Yu and Pei Huan had been scared. If Chichi had not stayed with Old Khan, would she have ended up like the others? Pei Huan reached out to hug Old Khan and said in a low voice, "This bad girl will definitely wake up." Old Khan replied in a low voice, "Yes, for sure." He and Tang Yu walked to the corridor outside. Old Khan had not smoked for a few days, and Pei Huan had been watching over him fiercely. At this moment, he was a little addicted to smoking. "Do you have a cigarette?" "I'll have one." Tang Yu gave him a cigarette and took out one for himself. He lit it up and took a puff. He looked up at the sky outside the window and said in a low voice, "I know she'll wake up one day, but I'm still worried." Old Khan patted him on the shoulder. "I understand how you feel. Tang Yu turned his head to look at him and also patted Old Khan on the shoulder. Thank you for this time. Old Khan pursed his lips and sighed. There's no need to thank me. Chichi is like my younger sister, and she's also Pei Huan's younger sister. Tang Yu put his arm around Old Khan's shoulder and said in a low voice after a while, I miss her a little. She was always in front of him, but she was always asleep. He felt a little lonely. He was also fragile. He also needed her to wake up and tell him that she was fine and that she was fine. Old Khan patted him comfortingly. You're so fragile. Tang Yu smiled. Even heroes have a weakness for the charms of a beautiful woman. Old Khan also smiled. He smoked with Tang Yu and looked at the sunset outside. Another day had passed. Would tomorrow be better? In the ward, Pei Huan wiped Pei Chichi's body with a warm towel. She was very careful and gentle. Perhaps because she had become a mother, Pei Huan was particularly sentimental. As she wiped her tears, she muttered, Pei Chichi, I can give you all the motherly love that my mom didn't give you in the past. Look, you're lying in Laro Khan's arms. From now on, you're Laro Khan's child. It's good to call Laro Khan Dad. You can also call me Mom in the future. My little Khan Xing's name won't be changed. As Pei Huan spoke, she wiped her tears. Tell me, after experiencing so much, we're still together. Does God want us to live in a different way? Pei Chichi, wake up if you want to bully me back. Pei Huan was quite tough at first. She even dared to talk about sleeping with Tang Yu. But as she spoke, Pei Chichi still didn't change. She cried again. Look at you. Why are you always lying here? I get worried too. A weak voice said, Pei Huan, when did you become so useless? Pei Huan was stunned. Then, she widened her eyes and looked at Pei Chichi on the bed. Pei Chichi's eyes were closed. Her face was still pale, but the corners of her mouth were slightly raised. Pei Huan was stunned for a moment. Then, she started crying. Pei Chichi, you damned child. You finally know that you're awake. Pei Chichi closed her eyes and smiled. Then, she started coughing. Pei Huan's heart ached. She squatted down and patted her chest to soothe her breathing. She said in a reproachful tone, You just woke up. Don't talk. Pei Chichi finally recovered. She tilted her head and looked at Pei Huan. You're too funny. Pei Huan cried and laughed at the same time. She was so happy that she didn't know what to say. Chapter 1180. Pei Chichi closed her eyes weakly, but her hand grabbed Pei Huan. Wait a minute. Pei Huan paused. Pei Chichi smiled. You used to sleep with Tang Yu, but you didn't get to sleep with him. Do you think you can sleep with him now? Won't Laro Khan kill you? Pei Huan was stunned for a full minute before she realized it. Tears quickly gathered in her eyes as she looked at Pei Chichi. Her eyes were filled with uneasiness. Chichi, you remember? She didn't know if Pei Chichi would remember her bad behavior in the past. She ignored her. Yes. I remember now. Little Pei Huan is quite bad. Pei Chichi was still very weak and her voice was a little soft. But I'm more happy that she has grown up to be such a good person. Pei Huan was a little disappointed and nervous at first, but then she blinked her tears. Chichi. Pei Chichi closed her eyes. Don't tell Tang Yu. Pei Huan blinked again. She seemed to understand what Pei Chichi meant, however, in order to take revenge, she told Tang Yu this when she went to tell him. Pei Huan ran over, panting, and saw Laro Khan and Tang Yu shoulder to shoulder. From behind, they looked quite affectionate. She said softly, Chichi is awake. Tang Yu's back was stiff. He slowly turned around and looked at Pei Huan. Pei Huan panted and nodded vigorously. She really is awake. But soon, she looked troubled. But it seems, her brain is not working well. Tang Yu let go of Laro Khan and walked quickly into the ward. Laro Khan walked to his wife and asked in a low voice, What's going on? What do you mean by her brain is not working well? Pei Chichi had lost her memory once. How could she not be working well? Dumbfounded. Stunned. Like a 3-year-old child. Old Khan glared at his wife, but Pei Huan glared back at him. What are you looking at? Go back and rest. Do you think I can't smell the smoke in your mouth? Old Khan felt a little uncomfortable and exhaled. You can smell it. Pei Huan sneered. What do you think? Old Khan chuckled. I just took a few random puffs. He hugged his wife and walked into the ward. Thinking about it, he smiled. No matter how stupid Chichi is, Tang Yu still likes her. To be honest, when he and Chichi were dug out that day, the scene must not have been very pleasant. The taste was probably also very sour. He saw that Tang Yu was hugging him like he was holding a treasure. This was true love. On the other side, Tang Yu quickly walked into the ward, walked to the door, and gently closed the door. His breathing was a little chaotic, and he was actually a little emotional at this moment. Pei Chichi heard the sound and opened her eyes. She lay on her side and looked at him. The corner of Tang Yu's mouth turned up slightly. Chichi. Pei Chichi looked at him and pouted. She said in a low voice, brother. Tang Yu was stunned for a moment. Brother? What did she call him? Pei Chichi was still gentle and obedient, her gaze pure and kind. Brother. Tang Yu had thought of many possibilities, but this one had never crossed his mind. Fortunately, she didn't call anyone else brother, but himself. He comforted himself this way. He sat beside her and reached out to stroke her hair. Chichi, are you feeling better now? This was a question and a test. She blinked and suddenly hugged him. Tang Yu. Is the child still around? Chapter 1181. Tang Yu coughed lightly and said shamelessly, the child is fine. She's grown up. Chichi, you've been in a coma for 5 years. Pei Chichi blinked and covered her eyes. She's all right, right? With that, she shifted her eyes away and looked at him seriously. We're siblings. Is there really no problem with the child we gave birth to? Tang Yu's handsome face was a little flustered. She had dug out the lie from a few years ago. He coughed lightly. Chichi, you're very careful. Pei Chichi nodded and looked at him again. Her eyes were watery and looked especially small. Tang Yu hadn't hugged her for a few days. Now that she was awake and in such a state, his desire was aroused. He wanted to kiss her and hug her. Hence, he pushed himself to kiss her. Pei Chichi didn't reject him. She lifted her face to receive his kiss. As his kiss deepened, her little hands wrapped around his neck. He slowly moved down and pressed her down on the bed. Tang Yu. Her voice was innocent and her gaze was as clear as water. The more innocent she was, the more he wanted it. Chichi, relax. He coaxed her. Because there was nothing wrong with her body. Now that she was awake, she had returned to the past. Let the past be the past. She was still his Chichi. Moreover, Chichi, don't you know that you've exposed yourself? Tang Yu chuckled and kissed her lower and lower, his lips kissed her neck. He could feel the blood rushing in her arteries. She was as anxious as him and wanted it just as much as he did. Suddenly, she looked at him pitifully. Brother, what we're doing isn't right. Tang Yu stopped. He used both hands to support himself so that he wouldn't crush her. His gaze was deep. He bent down and kissed her little mouth again and again. Are you sure, Chichi? I'm sure. She was probably afraid that he would go berserk and shamelessly hugged his waist. Tang Yu looked down at the little person in his arms and let out a long sigh. He knew that she was pretending, but she was putting in a lot of effort, so he played along. He was overjoyed. His Chichi had remembered everything. But at the same time, he was worried that she would remember those sad memories and become unhappy. But he was thinking too much. The little person hugged his neck and called out happily, Brother, I want to go to the toilet. Tang Yu gave her a meaningful look before picking her up. Carry me, big brother. He didn't leave even after placing her on the toilet. Pei Chichi looked at him. We've always been like this. He leaned on the side, looked at her calmly, and smiled. Pei Chichi pouted. Since he didn't mind, she didn't stand on ceremony either. He had seen her in such a sorry state in the mountains. Pei Chichi was just like that. Tang Yu smiled and moved closer to her ear. His voice was a little low. brother used to take care of the baby like this. Pei Chichi raised her head and looked at him. He smiled and picked her up. Big brother will help you take a bath. I'm so tired. I want to sleep. She lay weakly in his arms. Tang Yu's smile deepened. Little fool, I lied to you. She had just woken up. How could she take a bath? In the end, he lay on the hospital bed as a pillow while Pei Chichi slept comfortably and happily. She placed her little hand on his chest and murmured Xiaoxin's name in a daze. Silly girl, you still know how to be careful after losing your memory. Tang Yu smiled faintly. However, since his wife liked it, he would cooperate. Chapter 1182. Pei Chichi stayed in the hospital for a week. Whenever she was free, she would visit Old Khan and Pei Huan. Old Khan's injuries were more serious. The muscles on his back were all bruised, and he had to stay in the hospital for another week to support the rocks so that they wouldn't crush her. In the ward, Old Khan lay on his stomach with his eyes closed. His upper body was bare, and Pei Huan was applying medicine for him. Pei Chichi looked at the bruises on Old Khan's back and felt a little guilty. She took the medicine from Pei Huan's hands and applied it for him gently. Old Khan didn't know that Pei Chichi had come over, and he grimaced in pain. Huan, be gentle. Pei Chichi glanced at Pei Huan before applying medicine for Old Khan gently. Old Khan thought that his wife didn't speak properly in private. His eyes were half closed, and he seemed a little intoxicated. My wife's hands are so powerful and comfortable. I'll make you comfortable one day. Before Pei Huan could flare up, Pei Chichi pressed on his back slightly. Master, who are you making comfortable? Old Khan was scared out of his wits. This voice. He turned around and saw Pei Chichi. He quickly sat up and put on his clothes. Pei Chichi saw that Old Khan's shong hair was sparse and shapeless. It seemed like Pei Huan had plucked it clean. Chichi? Old Khan asked tentatively. You remember now? Pei Chichi nodded and smiled. Seems like you're doing well, master. Old Khan glanced at Pei Huan and scratched his head. Not bad. Pei Huan also glanced at him. The flirtatious look in her eyes couldn't be concealed. Pei Chichi sighed. Who would have thought that Pei Huan and Old Khan would be so compatible? At this moment, Pei Huan said slowly while staring at Old Khan, "Oh right, Sumo is back." Pei Chichi and Pei Huan looked at Old Khan in unison, especially Pei Huan. She said slowly, "The public doesn't remember what happened in the past after all these years. Sumo probably didn't have a good time abroad, so she came back. When she heard that you were hospitalized, she came to visit you. However, you weren't there that day. The things are here." Pei Huan had grown some brains now. She didn't say it before, but now that Pei Chichi was here, she said it. She went to get something. It was a set of top-notch ointment. Sumo was very considerate. Laro Khan's eyes were a little blank. He sat on the bed and gave a hollow laugh. What kind of medicine doesn't this hospital have? Huan, you can do whatever you want with him. Pei Huan's gaze was still fixed on Old Khan. Where's that person? Do you want to see him? I left my number. Pei Huan generously handed Sumo's name card to Old Khan as she spoke. She looked nonchalant as though she had accepted everything. Old Khan's heart pounded as he held it. It wasn't because of Sumo's name card, but because he couldn't figure out what his Huan was thinking. Would she run away with Kanxing in a fit of anger? He couldn't chase after her now that he was injured. You can see him if you want. I won't stop you. Pei Huan played with her fingernails. Old Khan, you gave me my son and saved Chichi. The Peis are indebted to you. It's up to you whether you want to leave or not. I won't stop you. Pei Chichi pursed her lips and smiled. Pei Huan's mouth was really good now. She spoke like a cedar. Chapter 1183. Don't make fun of me. How can I compare to Sumo? She looks like a little girl now. Pei Huan was telling the truth. Sumo seemed to have been injected with some kind of injection, and she looked 10 years younger. However, her face looked awkward no matter how one looked at it. Old Khan chuckled. I won't look at her no matter how young she is. She won't look as good as our Huan Huan even if she's naked. Pei Chichi couldn't stop laughing. Pei Huan glared at Old Khan. This old pervert. That night, Pei Huan fell asleep. Old Khan leaned against the headboard and wanted to smoke. He reached out and touched Sumo's name card instead of the box of cigarettes. He looked at it for a while with a complicated expression on his face. Then, his brows slowly relaxed, the past seemed to have been unraveled in his expression, and he felt relieved. Perhaps he still felt guilty towards Sumo all these years, but after this incident, he was finally sure, it was all in the past. Old Khan threw the name card into the wastepaper basket and slid down to hug Pei Huan. He kissed her hair and said with a smile, "Are you pretending to be asleep?" Pei Huan replied nonchalantly. Old Khan smiled. "I won't see you again, Huan Huan." His voice was especially deep in the night. "I don't want to see you again. It's boring." Pei Huan turned around and hugged him, burying her face in his chest. His chest felt warm. After a while, Pei Huan asked, "Old Khan, am I on top?" Old Khan's breathing was hot, and he looked at her with eyes that seemed to be spewing fire. His voice was hoarse as he said, "Really?" Pei Huan was the type who could fight, but she definitely wasn't the type to talk nonsense. She grabbed onto his xiong's fur and pulled it down. "Lie down and don't move later." She patted Old Khan's face. "Or else it will hurt." Old Khan was so excited, he immediately lay down and rubbed his hands. "Honey, hurry up." At this moment, Sumo had probably become a bubble. Old Khan only had eyes for his little vixen. The next morning, the cleaner came to check on the room and took away the 3 condoms that Old Khan and Pei Huan had used in one night. There was also Sumo's name card in the wastebasket. The cleaners whispered in each other's ears. The man in the VIP ward was really amazing. He went into battle with an injury and did it 3 times in one night. Laro Khan became famous after the battle at Shenyuan Hospital, and Pei Huan was also accused of having a strong desire for sex. Later on, Sumo came to the hospital again. Pei Huan generously allowed them to meet before she left. After all, Old Khan only loved her. No matter how powerful Sumo was, she couldn't do anything to Old Khan. After Sumo left, Pei Huan returned to the ward. The 2 women passed by each other with unfriendly gazes. Sumo couldn't accept it. She had missed out on a good man, a man who had loved her deeply, and Pei Huan had won Old Khan's heart. When she was talking to Old Khan kept looking outside the ward. Sumo was a smart person, so how could she not know what Old Khan was thinking? Sumo finally gave up. She returned overseas and never returned to B City. Pei Huan told Pei Chichi that the 8-Nation Alliance army had finally retreated from the border. Pei Chichi couldn't stop laughing, but she still had to leave the hospital first. She was fine, so it wasn't good for her to stay in the hospital. Moreover, she missed Xiaoshan. Tang Yu picked up Pei Chichi and returned to the rose garden. Chapter 1184. She was willing to pretend, and he was willing to cooperate. He reached out to rub her long hair, and his voice was a little hoarse. Xiaoshan may be more enthusiastic in a while. She buried her face in his arms and laughed, calling him brother. This little fool, she was so good at pretending. When he was her brother, she hated him so much. How could she be so obedient now? Tang Yu reached out and patted the little fellow in his arms, and smiled. When they arrived at the rose garden, they got out of the car, and a fat little thing was wrapped around their feet. Pei Chichi held Xiaoshan, and the feeling in her heart was different. She had forgotten before, and only knew that Xiaoshan was her own child, but now it was different. She remembered how hard it was to get this child, and how difficult it was for her to make the choice on the day she married Tang Yu. She did not feel heartache at first, but the moment she saw Xiaoshan, all her emotions collapsed. She held Xiaoshan, and had a feeling of regaining what she had lost. Tang Yu reached out to pinch her little face, carried her upstairs, and carried her straight to the bed. Xiaoshan rolled on the bed, and was extremely happy. Tang Yu propped his hands on both sides of Pei Chichi's body, and his face was close to hers. His voice was a little hoarse. "Chichi, do you still want to pretend?" He kissed her every time he said a word. Pei Chichi bit her lip, and was forced to lie on the bed. He hung above her, and restrained himself from kissing her. "Tonight, we'll continue." Pei Chichi's little hands hugged his neck, and she pressed her face into his neck. "Tang Yu, you found out?" He knocked her little head. Such poor acting skills. Pei Chichi smiled sullenly, hugged him, and pressed her face against his body, smelling the good smell on his body. After a while, she whispered, "Tang Yu, I'm back." His heart throbbed, and even if Xiaoshan was still there, he could not help but look down to find her little mouth, and deeply kissed it. Their lips and teeth intertwined, and there was endless lingering. Xiaoshan knelt on the side, and stared blankly at Papa and Mama kissing. Papa seemed to be eating Mama. "Eat." Xiaoshan suddenly burst into tears. So this is what eating is like. She did not want to be eaten by that little brother. She did not want to exchange saliva like this, so dirty. Xiaoshan could not stop the parents even if she cried. Tang Yu covered Pei Chichi's ears with his hand, kissed the corner of her mouth and chuckled, "She's too noisy." She lifted her face to receive his kiss. Then, "Should we wait for tonight?" Tang Yu released her mouth with difficulty, his eyes burning. 5 times. Pei Chichi bit her lip. 6 times. Tang Yu's eyes lit up and he pinched her little face. "Deal." At noon, Lin Yun, Zhao Yi, and little Zhao Yang came over for lunch. Tang Jiyuan was there too. Pei Chichi was successfully drunk and didn't wake up until the night. She opened her eyes, and the light around her was dim yellow. She turned around and saw that she was wearing a white evening dress, and the snow-white bedsheet was covered with a layer of rose petals. "You're awake?" She heard an elegant male voice. It was very pleasant. She raised her head and looked at Tang Yu. He was the same as the first time she saw him, wearing a formal 3-piece suit. He bent down slightly and kissed her forehead. "Miss Pei, can I have a dance with you?" Pei Chichi smiled slightly. "What's your name?" "Tang Yu." He held her hand and pulled her up, his body close to hers. "Now, focus." Chapter 1185. He chuckled and hugged her tightly, his forehead touching hers. "Let's dance first." The lights flickered, and the night breeze outside the window blew up the white curtains, piling up layers of waves. He hugged her and danced in the large space. She stepped on his instep with her bare feet, rested her little face on his shoulder, and hugged his neck softly. Occasionally, he would kiss her lightly and nibble on her little mouth. After a few times, she was out of breath and looked up at him. Her eyes were full of dependence and love. It was intoxicating. Unknowingly, she fell into the sofa, and he knelt on one knee on the sofa to kiss her. She looked up and accepted his kiss helplessly. Her little hand gently rubbed the back of his neck. This was Pei Chichi's habit in the past. She had not done this since she lost her memory. Tang Yu's heart softened a little, and his whole body was burning with animal blood. However, he still restrained himself from kissing her lightly, even though his body was already so tense that it hurt. He still insisted on taking it slow. Pei Chichi nibbled on his lips, and her long eyelashes fluttered gently. She was infinitely shy and charming. "Tang Yu, what are you waiting for?" He raised his handsome eyebrows and looked down at the little person in his arms. After a long time, he chuckled softly. He raised his hand to look at the time, and his voice was a little hoarse. "It's 12 o'clock now. If we do it 6 times, it'll be around 7 o'clock tomorrow morning." As he spoke, he kissed her, and his voice was also warm. "Mrs. Tang, are you sure you can handle it?" Her little hand reached behind her and pulled back gently. Then, her body moved slightly. Tang Yu's breathing suddenly became hot. He squinted at the beautiful scene in front of him. Even though they had done it countless times, she rarely took the initiative like this, not to mention after she lost her memory. She was like a little piece of wood. Although it was interesting, there was always something missing. At this moment, Tang Yu realized that it was the combination of the soul and the body that was missing. He reached out and gently touched her red little mouth. Chichi, it might be very painful. Aren't you afraid? She lowered her eyes, her long eyelashes trembling slightly, and there seemed to be flowing lights in her eyes. Tang Yu covered her eyes and kissed her fiercely. He pulled her out of the gown and pressed her tightly against his body. She was so delicate that even the most expensive material of his clothes seemed rough. Especially the contrast between black and white, it was so dazzling. Tang Yu's face was close to hers, and his voice was low and hoarse. Chichi, I might be a little rough. If it hurts, scream. She bit her lip. She would not scream. She hugged his shoulders with her little hands and said softly, be gentle. He was tormenting her very lightly, with a very wicked sense of humor. That neither up nor down almost drove her crazy. In the end, she was the one who begged him to be more rough. That night, he did not let her off either. For Tang Yu and Pei Chichi, this separation was not just 10 days, but 2.5 years. How long had she lost her memory? How long had he waited for her? This moment was as moving as it was moving. Just like what Larukan said, absence makes the heart grow fonder. Moreover, their hearts had been separated for so long, she wanted to end it, and she even climbed into his arms to please him. He had enjoyed it, but he still did not let her off. Chapter 1186. Early in the morning light shone through the glass, and the person on the bed was sleeping soundly. Tang Yu was lying flat with the quilt covering his waist. Pei Chichi's little face was on his waist, and her little hands were holding his waist. Her long hair was scattered around, entwined. A small hand grabbed onto the door and stealthily entered the master bedroom. When she saw the clothes scattered all over the floor, she sucked in a breath of cold air. Oh my God! Papa and Mima were fighting again. Xiaoshan stood there and closed her eyes. His eyes were shut tight. She felt that the world was spinning, and her little fat hand held her head. Oh my God, she was going to faint. She must be calm. Papa must not have eaten Mima. Even if he did, he should have spat it out now. Xiaoshan opened her eyes and looked in the direction of Papa and Mima. Mima was still there, but she could not see below her waist. Could it be that Papa ate her? Xiaoshan tiptoed over, half squinted her eyes, and suddenly lifted the quilt. Then she opened her eyes wide, extremely shocked, and could not believe what she saw. How could this be? It was not Papa who ate her mother, but Tang Yu woke up. After looking down, he quickly covered himself with the quilt again, and said angrily, Tang Share. As a father, he would only call her by her full name when he was the most angry. Xiaoxin's eyes flashed with tears, and she looked at her Papa with some horror. After a long time, Xiaoxin said pitifully, Papa has been eaten. Then, in the future, if that little brother showed an expression of wanting to eat her, she could also eat that little brother. Oh! Xiaoxin felt that she was very smart. But now that Papa seemed to want to eat her, Xiaoxin immediately ran to the door, and the little white lace dress on her flew up. Tang Yu lay back heavily, and reached out to touch Pei Chichi in his arms, and smiled helplessly. What should I do? I saw this at such a young age. As he spoke, he slid his finger over, and gestured to Pei Chichi. Pei Chichi had just woken up. She buried herself in his arms and felt ashamed to face anyone. Tang Yu chuckled and whispered in her ear, she thought you ate me. She buried her little face in his embrace, her little hands pinching his waist. Her voice was coquettish as she said, don't say it, don't say it. Tang Yu chuckled in a deep voice. They were still together to begin with. Now that she was throwing a tantrum and stirring up a fire, Pei Chichi stopped throwing a tantrum and stared at him in disbelief. Didn't he have a vasectomy? Why were their functions even more powerful than before? Her eyes were watery as she gazed at him softly. Tang Yu chuckled softly. He reached out to hold her in his arms and kissed her lightly. I'll go do some recovery in a day. She was still silly. He paused for a moment before saying, in the past, it was also to prevent us from being plotted against. If that happened, Chichi, we might not be together anymore. Now, there's no need for that anymore. If you don't like me doing protection, I can choose not to recover. Pei Chichi lay in his arms, and her voice was very soft. But this 10 years will affect fertility. Chichi, are you going to give birth? He touched her little head with a doting expression. Actually, the doctor had told him that there was basically no problem with her body. It was not impossible for her to give birth if she wanted to. Chapter 1187. As he said that, Pei Chichi hugged his waist. Tang Yu, do you still want another child? His voice was a little low. Someone has to inherit Boy Yi and Jin Tai her. Chichi, do you think Xiaoshan is up to the task? Pei Chichi lay in his arms. Her voice was a little low. Tang Yu, do you feel particularly tired? It's all right. His voice was gentle, and there was a subtle chuckle in it. No matter how much work there is, it won't be as tiring as last night. He was implying something. Pei Chichi blushed. She hit his shoulder and glared at him. Tang Yu chuckled softly. Then, he chuckled. Chichi, let nature take its course regarding the child. Dr. Mai also said that she might not be able to conceive easily. Seeing that she didn't object to it, he decided to go for a recovery and leave the rest to fate. Pei Chichi hummed in agreement. She placed her little face in his arms and hugged his waist with her little hands. It would be good to raise a child like Xiaoshan from a young age. It had to be said that Pei Chichi was quite hopeless. She had never thought of giving birth to a boy as wise and powerful as Tang Yu, because she didn't know how to teach a boy like that. Tang Yu looked at her distressed little eyes and smiled again. All right, get up. Otherwise, you probably won't be able to get up. Pei Chichi bit her little mouth and glared at him. How could she get up now that he was like this? Tang Yu pulled her into his arms and kissed her. His voice was a little muffled. Then let's do it again. It was already 2 o'clock in the afternoon when they got up. When Tang Yu brought Pei Chichi downstairs, Lin Yun showed a look of disapproval. It was too indulgent. How could Pei Chichi's little body take it? However, Lin Yun couldn't say it. After all, it was a matter between a couple. After dinner, Tang Yu said to Pei Chichi in a low voice, "Shall we go and see Uncle Shen later?" Pei Chichi nodded and looked at Tang Yu. Do Dad and Auntie Shen live in the elegant villa? Tang Yu's expression was unreadable, and so was Lin Yun. However, the mother and son were both sophisticated, so they naturally wouldn't let Pei Chichi see anything. Lin Yun sighed inwardly. Chichi would still be sad in the end. More than 2 years had passed, and the people had changed. At 4 o'clock, Tang Yu drove Pei Chichi out. She sat in the passenger seat and looked happy. My dad knows I'm back, right? With that said, she lowered her head and said like a little girl, he didn't even come to see me. He must not know that I have regained my memory. With that said, she smiled and grabbed Tang Yu's arm. Let's go buy my dad's favorite tea, okay? He will be very happy to see it. But you can't make me drink anymore. Every time, Tang Yu would deliberately make her drunk and then take advantage of her. She knew his tricks very well. Tang Yu turned his head to look at her and said heavily, okay. He still went to a famous tea shop and picked a box of good quality red robe. When he put it in the trunk, he looked at her and suddenly said, Uncle Shen doesn't live in the elegant villa now. Pei Chichi was stunned for a moment. Then, she smiled reluctantly. Where does he live then? Did he go abroad? However, she felt a little uneasy, as if the real situation was worse than she thought. She got into the car again and didn't ask anymore. Instead, she looked in the direction of the road sign. Chapter 1188. Pei Chichi sat in the car and didn't get out. She looked at Tang Yu sideways and said, Tang Yu, what happened to him? His nerves were severely damaged. Not long after the accident, he slowly. Tang Yu said the cruel word, Alzheimer's. Pei Chichi's eyes froze. She stared at his eyes and couldn't believe what he said. Tang Yu said in a deep voice, Chichi, I'm very sorry. I couldn't take care of them when you were not around. Pei Chichi looked at him for a long time before saying softly, take me there. Tang Yu got out of the car and took the Da Hong Pao out of the trunk. He held it in one hand and Pei Chichi's hand in the other as they walked down the stairs. He said as he walked, Auntie Shen's health isn't very good, especially her eyes. She can't take care of Uncle Shen alone, so I arranged for 2 nurses to take care of them. Now, they're doing well. Pei Chichi knew that Tang Yu was referring to the good in Shen Zhongshan's world. She felt a little sad and hugged his arm. Tang Yu, thank you. She knew that he must have put in a lot of effort. Tang Yu patted her hand and didn't say anything. When she saw Shen Zhongshan, Pei Chichi's eyes welled up. Although she had imagined what it would be like, she was still very sad. Shen Zhongshan sat there and looked into the distance, not saying a word. Pei Chichi stood behind him for a long time, but he didn't turn back. She wished that she could hear him call her little sister. That would make her feel better. The nurse's voice was a little soft. Mr. Shen hasn't spoken much since he got sick. Other than eating and sleeping, he's been drawing. Pei Chichi squatted in front of Shen Zhongshan and placed her hand on the back of his hand. Her voice was a little shaky. Dad, I'm back. The warmth on the back of his hand made Shen Zhongshan slowly turn his head. He looked at Pei Chichi and his lips moved, but he didn't say a word. After a while, Shen Zhongshan suddenly opened his mouth again and shouted with difficulty, draw, draw. The nurse hurriedly took the painting he usually drew and showed it to him. She coaxed him patiently, look, the painting is here. Shen Zhongshan's hand touched those paintings. His movements were a little stiff, as if he was touching some kind of treasure. After a long time, he looked up at Pei Chichi, and raised his fingers with difficulty. Pei Chichi rested her face on his knees and let his fingers fall on her face. Shen Zhongshan's fingers slowly moved across her little face. Later on, he was very anxious, as if he was looking for something. Pei Chichi's lips trembled. Dad. Shen Zhongshan's body trembled. Then, he shook his head as if he was thinking of something. He shook his head again and finally let go of his hand. He stared blankly at Pei Chichi. I'm Chichi. Her fingers stroked the pages of drawings. Every page was messy, but she could tell that every single one of them was her. Even in this state, Shen Zhongshan was still thinking about her. Maybe it was because of her disappearance that his condition worsened and brought it forward. She grabbed his hand and let him put his palm on her little face. Shen Zhongshan's eyes suddenly welled up with tears. He spat out a word with difficulty, cry. After a while, he said softly, don't cry. Chapter 1189. Pei Chichi reached out and hugged him. She wanted to cry, but she was afraid that he would be sad. She hoped that he would be happy and forget about everything. Shen Zhongshan's movements were very slow. He looked down at the girl on his lap, and there was a hint of gentleness in his eyes. Perhaps it was because he knew that she was the one he had been waiting for. Shen Zhongshan's fingers patted her back stiffly. His voice was very soft, so soft that it was almost inaudible. But Pei Chichi could still hear it. He was telling her not to cry. He was coaxing her, telling her to be good. She closed her eyes, but her tears did not stop. She hoped that Shen Zhongshan's condition would improve after seeing her. But the doctor told her that it was impossible, because this was the best outcome for Shen Zhongshan. Pei Chichi was disappointed. She was back, but Shen Zhongshan did not understand why she called him daddy again. Later, she saw Mrs. Shen again. Mrs. Shen's eyesight was so poor that she could barely see anything. She could only tell from the sounds outside that someone had come in. The nurse said softly, "It's Mr. and Mrs. Tang." Mrs. Shen looked up and was stunned. She mumbled, "Which Mr. and Mrs. Tang?" Tang Yu squatted in front of her and said in a low voice, "Auntie Shen, it's me, Tang Yu. Chichi is back. I brought her here to see you." Mrs. Shen began to tremble. She stared at Tang Yu blankly, then shifted her gaze to Pei Chichi. She couldn't see the person clearly, only a dark shadow. "Is it Chichi?" Mrs. Shen cried. She was very sad. She had not cried like this ever since her eyes were damaged. Tang Yu said that if Pei Chichi was back, would his daughter, Shen Lian, be less sinful? Pei Chichi held her trembling hand and said softly, "It's me." Mrs. Shen held her hand back. In the past few years, Mrs. Shen had become thinner and thinner. Her fingers had become so thin that there was only a layer of skin on them. When she held Pei Chichi's hand tightly, it was painful. However, Pei Chichi only felt pity for her. She used to be so plump, but now she had become like this. She couldn't say that it was all Shen Lian's fault. Back then, if it wasn't for Zhao Ku, perhaps they wouldn't have today. Mrs. Shen was very strong. She gripped Pei Chichi's hand tightly. Her eyes were not focused on Pei Chichi's face, and her voice was hoarse. "Chichi, I beg you to talk to Tang Yu. Let Shen Lian go, please." Pei Chichi was stunned. She slowly turned around to look at Tang Yu, but she didn't make a sound. Tang Yu's expression was a little complicated. After a while, he said softly, "Okay." Pei Chichi was even more shocked. She looked at Tang Yu with a questioning look on her face. Meanwhile, Mrs. Shen burst into tears. After they went out, Pei Chichi sat in the car and asked softly, "Where is Shen Lian?" Tang Yu's fingers were on the steering wheel. After a long silence, he turned to look at Pei Chichi and said, "She's crazy." She still looked at him and didn't say anything for a long time. Tang Yu said slowly, "Aunt Shen is like this because of Shen Lian, but I won't be soft-hearted." "Where is she?" Pei Chichi asked with difficulty. Tang Yu took a cigarette from the console, put it to his lips, and lowered his head to light it. After a long time, he said softly, "She's in this nursing home, but she'll never be able to step out of that room." Chapter 1190. And the reason why Tang Yu did not allow them to meet was because Mrs. Shen might let Shen Lian go if they met once. "I'm not heartless." Tang Yu rolled down the car window to prevent her from breathing in the second-hand smoke. He exhaled a long puff of smoke and said slowly, "Uncle Shen's previous plan was to bring Shen Lian to settle down abroad. Now I want them to be together, and it can be considered as fulfilling Uncle Shen's wish. There's another option, which is to send Shen Lian to prison. But in that dark place, if Shen Lian went there, she would have died long ago." Tang Yu paused. "Chichi, don't beg me. If it wasn't for Uncle Shen, I would have killed her directly." That day was an eternal nightmare for Tang Yu. The way Chichi looked back at him broke his heart. Pei Chichi's heart was wet. She looked at Tang Yu and did not say a word. She was not a soft-hearted saint. That day was also a nightmare for her. When Shen Lian's knife was placed on Xiaoxin's neck, she felt that she could die from her heart beating too fast at any time. Tang Yu finished smoking the last cigarette and leaned his head against the back of the chair. He smiled bitterly. "Chichi, do you know why you were spared, and your nerves were not damaged like Uncle Shen and Shen Lian?" Pei Chichi looked at him. "Because when you fell into the sea and were fished out, your stomach was this big. It was equivalent to having your stomach pumped." He patted her. "It was a blessing in disguise." Pei Chichi replied with an "oh" and was a little dumbfounded. "Chichi, I will never let you leave me again." He stroked her hair. "Go to work at my company." She looked at him with a surprised and puzzled expression. "I asked Xiao Ran to add a small desk in the office. In the future, you will be my..." He said a few words. "Personal assistant." Her voice was soft. "What about Meng Qingcheng?" Tang Yu smiled lightly. "Qingcheng might be very busy these days." She looked at him. Tang Yu threw the cigarette butt away and patted her hand. "I think he might propose to Xiao Ran soon." "Propose?" Pei Chichi's eyes widened. "But they don't seem to be together. I saw them sleeping in the same ward in Zhengcheng." He held her hand and laughed at her foolishness. Xiao Ran sprained her ankle in Zhengcheng and stayed there for 2 days. He accidentally found out that they were living together. Qingcheng had probably thought it through, but he didn't know if Ran had forgiven him. Pei Chichi was still looking at him blankly. After a while, she asked, "Maybe we didn't sleep together. It's normal for colleagues to take care of each other." Tang Yu looked at her with a burning gaze. Pei Chichi thought of what he had done to her in the hospital, so she shut up. He started the car. Pei Chichi looked at the green bricks and white tiles here and said softly, Tang Yu, we'll come here often in the future, right? He grunted in acknowledgement and slowly drove the car away. Pei Chichi didn't ask to see Shen Lian, and he didn't let Mrs. Shen see her. In fact, Shen Lian had committed suicide a year ago. However, he didn't say it. Perhaps it would be better to keep this a secret forever. At least Mrs. Shen would always have hope and wouldn't commit suicide. And Chichi wouldn't feel guilty. Tang Yu knew that when necessary, his heart was colder than anyone else's, and his Chichi would be responsible for her happiness. Pei Chichi turned back to take one last look, feeling a little reluctant to leave. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.